Can't see my thing now. Oh yeah. Okay.
Good morning, everybody. I hope you can all hear me. Okay. You're all very welcome. It's strange speaking to my computer here, not seeing an audience. You're all very welcome to our conference, Data Driving Diversity. My name is Rory Carey, and I'm Director of Culture and Engagement here in UCD. And I'm one of the moderators for today's conference. My co-moderator is Marcelina Fogarty, and Marcelina is Strategic Equality, Diversity and Inclusion Manager. We have well over 200 delegates from all of the Irish universities, most of the Institute of Technology, Higher Education Authority, and from a range of public and private sector companies. It's great to see such a high level of engagement on what is such an important topic. The conference has been months in the planning, and I'd like to thank all of our speakers in particular for giving up their time and sharing their insight with us today. I also want to recognise the sterling work of Tom Costello and Licia Carlisi from our EDI team in organising this conference. Originally, we planned to have this event on our lovely university campus. While the networking opportunities are now limited, we decided to still go ahead as a webinar, as the debate and discussion on this important topic of data-driving diversity needs to continue. Please bear with us, it's our first time running a webinar conference on this scale, so we're hoping that the technology gremlins will be kind to us today. I'm going to hand over to my co-moderator, Marcy, to take us through the plan for today and to introduce our first speaker, and I'll talk to you again soon. Thanks very much.
Okay, thanks, Rory. Good morning, everyone. Again, I hope everyone can hear me okay. So I'm just going to go through some housekeeping with you just for how we're going to run the session today for the next 3 hours. So the session is going to run up to 1 o'clock, but we will have a couple of breaks throughout, one at 10:05 and one at 11:50. We are recording the session, so that will be made available on our EDI website shortly after the session today. The presentations will also be made available on our website. We really want to hear from you throughout the session as well. So, please, as you're listening to the presentations, do put any questions, comments into the Q&A function, which should be at the bottom of your screen. So that's mainly it. Just to say, I hope everyone enjoys the session today and you learn a lot from it. We certainly will, and we're looking forward to that discussion with our lineup of speakers. So now I just want to introduce to you Professor Colin Scott. He's the Vice President for Equality, Diversity and Inclusion in UCD, and he's just going to say a few words to welcome you all here today. Thank you.
Thank you, Marcelina. Thank you, Rory. It's very good to be able to welcome so many of you to this virtual conference, Data Driving Diversity. And I want to start by saying something about sexual harassment and sexual violence in the higher education system. Only a few years ago, colleagues in higher education institutions might have said that given the data showing very low numbers of formal complaints under dignity and respect policies, that there was no evidence of significant large-scale sexual harassment and sexual violence affecting students or staff in higher education. The view that we do not have a sexual violence problem in higher education is now contradicted both by testimony and experience and by more and better data, drawing on survey evidence. With respect to employees, the US National Academies of Sciences, Engineering and Medicine reported in 2018, drawing on 2003 research, the effect that 58% of female academic faculty and staff experienced sexual harassment, defined by the academies to include gender harassment, unwanted sexual attention and coercion. With respect to students in Ireland, NUIG Galway Consent Programme, in partnership with the Union of Students of Ireland, published survey results earlier this year, which I know shocked many of us, with statistics that 29% of females, 10% of males, and 28% non-binary students reported non-consensual penetration by incapacitation, force, or threat of force during their time in college. We have much to learn about developing appropriate and effective responses to sexual violence, and there's a national commitment to eliminating the scourge of sexual violence in higher education through the ESHTA programme and through the government consent framework. Many of you will have seen that Simon Harris, the new Minister for Further and Higher Education, Research, Innovation and Science, made a range of commitments in June, including, with respect to data, a national annual survey of students and staff to monitor their experiences of sexual harassment and sexual violence in third level education. And we've made a start to improving institutional data with the development of anonymous reporting systems, such as UCD's report and support tool launched earlier this year. And UCD will be publishing data both from the anonymous reporting and from our dignity and respect formal complaints fairly imminently. And it seems to me likely that we will also need to collect and report institutional data on informal contacts and disclosures if we're to better understand the challenge we face. We've seen over recent days the effects of powerful and courageous testimony of the effects of sexual harassment for women in academia, both in generating vital discussion through the media social media, and also in empowering victims to come forward and challenging higher education institutions to learn and to act. We can see how important data has been and will continue to be in shaping our knowledge. It feels like we are at least at the beginning of the measures which we must take as a sector to eliminate sexual violence from our campuses and wider society. Such measures need to be mutually supporting with significant cultural change in higher education. Think about our topic for today, data on diversity more broadly. Sometimes colleagues ask me, is enhancing our data the correct focus? What we need surely is not more and better data, but action to promote diversity, to promote inclusion, to remove barriers to equality. We do, of course, need these actions, but enhancing the way we collect and analyse data is one of those actions and a prerequisite to many other forms of intervention that are dependent on data to know what are the challenges and to assess what progress we're making in addressing the challenges. It's especially important, I think, that in higher education institutions where we value and advance research and knowledge, that we can effectively draw data analysis into underpinning effective EDI measures and also effective cultural change. Data is vital to understand the state of any system in terms not only of the snapshot of who is in it, at what level, but also to observe the trends over time. What proportion of women are getting promoted to full professor? Do senior management teams and governing boards comply with the 40% norm for participation of males and females? What's the participation attainment levels of students with disabilities, of students from socioeconomically disadvantaged backgrounds, and of students from minority ethnic groups? Dynamic data informs us of the state of the system and assists in identifying the challenges we need to address. Data can create pressures, but also rivalry to act on clear injustices, and while at the same time legitimating key equality actions, for example, demonstrating the progression and achievement of students entering higher education with reduced points or on varied entry routes. It's been observed in the UK by Kawant Bhopal and Holly Henderson that the focus of Athena Swan on gender has led to a prioritization of collecting, publishing and using data on gender over data with respect to other protected groups, in particular in priority to understanding the data on minority ethnic groups in higher education. But it's not so long ago that we had little or no data on gender in employment in higher education, since, as Pat O'Connor noted, the HEA stopped publishing employment data in 2004, only to resume a systemic data series for institutional staff profiles in 2015. We can and must secure better data to inform actions with respect to all our protected groups, and we owe a debt of gratitude to the growing cohort of data professionals who Rory Carey referenced earlier, who support this urgent and important work. Having said something of the case for close attention to collecting and analysing diversity data in higher education, I'll conclude now with some brief remarks on limitations and challenges, some of which I hope we will address today. First, data collection has not been systematic or unproblematic. We still have legacies of systems where employees or students might assume that data on sexual orientation or race is being collected to support discrimination rather than equality. And whilst collection of data on disability and gender in the workplace and in education is long accepted, there are still sensitivities around collecting data on race. There are also sensitivities around categorization of data, shaping the content of questions to data subjects and the way questions are asked. Collaboration between higher education institutions and with state agencies such as the Central Statistics Office and the HEA, and representative bodies including the IUA and THEA, has been and will continue to be, I think, extremely important to advancing policies on data collection and analysis. Quality of data is important. From my earliest engagement in my own research on regulation, looking at data of state agencies that was collected from businesses, firms emphasised to me the importance of ensuring that the data supplied is used internally as part of the day-to-day operations of the data supplier, not simply as a matter of efficiency, but also so the data is constantly used and tested within the organisation. This is consistent with the idea that data should drive behaviours within organisations also. There's a lot of criticism of the neoliberalisation of higher education. It's sometimes said that a focus on data and indicators provides evidence of this ideological turn in higher education. Whatever your view on that trend, I think it's important that EDI data is collected and scrutinized internally and externally alongside other data. An example of that management adage, what gets measured is what gets done. The proliferation of data, I think, has been a vital aspect of mainstreaming of equality, diversity and inclusion in higher education in Ireland. Data can create rivalry between organisations, which may be positive, but can also promote gaming of data. Open dialogue between the partners in EDI data in HE should promote continued collaboration, learning and positive participation, while at the same time enhancing the opportunity for shirking or gaming to be detected within networks. And it's fitting, I think, that I finish my remarks with this emphasis on the importance of collaboration within the higher education sector, as today's event is one of those collaborative actions. I'd like to thank everyone who's involved in organising this event, everyone involved in participating, including everyone on the Zoom call today, our guest speakers nationally and also from overseas, and my colleagues in UCD, Tom Costello, Marcelina Fogarty, Lisha Kalesi, Rory Carey, who've been so closely involved in organising our event. I wish everyone a rewarding engagement on these very important topics today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Colin, for that thought-provoking speech. We're not going to take questions at the moment, but what we will do is take questions after our next speaker. So as Marcelina has pointed out already, the facility is within Zoom there on the Q&A. So anybody that has any questions, please start populating the Q&A box on Zoom. So without any further ado, it gives me great pleasure to introduce our next speaker, Dr. Joanna Jasiewicz from the University of Cambridge. Joanna works as an equality diversity consultant at the University of Cambridge and is a sociologist by background. She specializes in the area of race and racism and is particularly interested in institutional change, normalizing discourse about race and racism, and the impact of white privilege and white fragility. Her topic today is going to cover data analytics to drive the equality and diversity agenda. And I'd just like to welcome Joanna to the university, and I look forward to hearing her contribution. Thanks, Joanna.
Thank you so much, Rory, for introducing me. Thank you, Marcelina. Thank you, Tom. Thank you, Rory, for inviting me to speak today. I'm truly delighted to be with you, connect with you over Zoom today. Just as much as it's slightly weird to speak, just seeing myself, I can feel the connection with so many of you here. So thank you all so very much. So I'm just starting to screen share. Hopefully you will be able to see my screen in a moment. Hopefully you can see my screen. If not, I'm sure the organizers will let me know. And just a couple of changes so that I can operate without problems. Yes. So today I'm going to, excellent. Today I'm going to talk with you, to speak with you, to discuss an issue of how data can be used to drive diversity. But actually, what I'm going to speak really more broadly is how data can be used to drive institutional change. Because in a way, I mean, driving diversity is one part of a parcel. Yes, we want to have more diverse students. We want to have, not just white body of staff, but actually it's much more than that. Because once, I mean, let's say we manage to get more Black students into the university, we manage to get more diverse body of staff, but what happens then? Are they having the same opportunities for promotion? Is their experience equally positive? Can they thrive at the university? So it's kind of, yes, diversity is important, but actually it's more than that. It's the first step. So very briefly, to kind of walk you through what I'm going to cover today, and my presentation is going to take around 10-12 minutes, leaving some time for questions. So very briefly, I'm going to talk about the Race Equality Charter Scheme, which the University of Cambridge took part in and is taking part right now. I'm going to give you some examples on how really powerful and crucial the data was to challenge some conceptions, to start conversations about race and racism at the university. Then I'm going to pause for a moment to think and maybe discuss with you also afterwards. Why is data so important, and is it possible that data can be to some extent an obstacle? So let's move to that afterwards. And then at the very end, I'll give you just three examples of actions that we developed, having gathered the data. So the data really driven those actions. And just here you may see one of the examples of quotes from our survey. So the survey that we had to use as the university who was applying for the Race Equality Charter. There is the requirement that you have to, as the university applying for the REC, you have to run surveys, and surveys do provide extreme wealth of qualitative data. And this data showed us the picture that we were aware in a way that it's there, but it was still shocking. And the qualitative data can be a really extremely powerful component of the whole analysis of data. So yes, quantitative data is hugely important. We have to know the broad patterns of promotions, recruitment, so on. But actually, without having this additional qualitative data, I don't think we would get in the conversations where we are now, because I think the data was shocking for many of us, and it's still shocking. And this quote and this image just kind of contrasts the very happy image of Cambridge or Oxford that we read. And then my colleagues are really not sure whether it's Cambridge or Oxford actually on this image. So of a boat race, and kind of contrasted with a quote of a black student and then black staff member who said that actually, I've never felt that I belonged at Cambridge. So kind of it provides us food for thought that actually, all those traditions, all those things that maybe to some extent Cambridge is really proud of can be exclusive, can be, access to those can be unequal. And we can see that there is no one who is of Black, of Asian background here on this boat. Maybe in the audience, but again, it wouldn't be a very active role there. So without further ado, I'd like to very briefly talk to you about the Race Equality Charter and why it was important. So as Professor Colin Scott mentioned earlier, so the Athena Swan scheme that operates in the United Kingdom, so universities can apply for it, and to get a bronze or silver or gold award, they have to analyze data, they have to submit a comprehensive application, and then definitely analyze data and have the action plan, 3-year or 4-year action plan ready. So it's following on that example, Advanced Equality Challenge Unit and now Advanced HE, to which the Equality Challenge Unit kind of merged into. So now we have the broad Advanced HE umbrella organization. They've said that they thought that actually, we have the Athena Swan for gender, but actually what happens with race, with ethnicity? We know there are problems, so how can we help universities to move forward on that front? And this is when, I think in around 2014, Race Equality Charter was piloted. University of Cambridge signed up to the Race Equality Charter in 2016, I think, yes, in 2016. And it took us 3 years to submit an application, which is a maximum amount that universities are given. And it was, in a way, it was a long time, but it wasn't a long time because there was so much data that hasn't been looked at, that had to be looked at systematically and comprehensively. So 3-year data on promotions, on membership in committees, on REF, on awarding gap, and broadly on student and staff balance. So a huge, it gave us a hugely powerful tool to actually be able to look at this data. And on top of that, or actually not really on top of that, but kind of in conjunction with this, we did, and we had to do, and we gladly did it. We run student and staff surveys, and how it works with the Race Equality Charter is that Advanced AG provides you questions, and you cannot delete any questions, but you can add on and kind of slightly modify, which is a great idea actually, because you can, institutions cannot remove, if there was that temptation, perhaps cannot remove questions that are particularly painful. So around experiences of racism and you know, all the harassment and discrimination. So we did all that. We did focus groups, we ran consultations, and we used also those 3 years to really start conversations about race and racism, because we knew that although in the past, I mean, there have been lots of efforts to work on race and racism at the university, driven mostly by wonderful students and brilliant members of staff. The institution as a whole didn't engage as much in questions around race and racism as it did on issues around gender. So it provided really a powerful vehicle channel for those efforts to really start talking about race. Because in a way, I mean, talking about race is not separate to action. I mean, there is so much resistance and also so much, as Renée Edo-Lodge calls it, I mean, conversations about race are messy, and there's lots of unwillingness to talk about race, but actually if we don't talk about race, we cannot move forward, we cannot really implement any meaningful actions if people are not comfortable just talking about race. And if you're interested, I mean, feel free to have a look at this website, where one of the tabs is about Race Equality Charter, and you can see the full application, the action plan, and happy to chat with you if you feel to get in touch about the details. So what I'm going to do now is to very briefly show you some examples of how we use the data, how data was helpful to challenge some assumptions and help us move forward. So the assumption number one was that, or is still there, I think, at our university, at other universities, and probably across the sectors, is that actually, you know, if I don't see racism, it's not there. I know it's, you know, it's somewhere in the US. We are all aware of the terrible killing of George Floyd. So it's kind of, there is this temptation to see it as something out there. And there is this strong resistance of not seeing it where you are, especially if you are a white member of staff who have not perhaps have not experienced racism yourself. So this is where hugely powerful data came from the surveys, came from focus groups, where we saw that around 1/3 of our staff either experienced or witnessed racism and racial discrimination, microaggressions. And around the same proportion was for students who took part in the survey, slightly more, even more than BAME students than BAME staff witnessed or experienced discrimination. So what we've learned through the survey also and consultations was that actually, yes, the 1/3 of BAME colleagues experience racism, but they do not really talk about those experiences with white members of staff. They share it within the BAME staff network. They share it within, you know, other kind of smaller networks, mostly consisting BAME colleagues. So in a way that what we've discovered, it was really quite shocking in a way that it's not that we live in this one kind of University of Cambridge. There are in fact 2 universities. One university which is aware of experiences of racism, witnesses it, and there is the other university that is very much kind of colorblind and, you know, believing that yes, you know, race doesn't matter, we are past it, and so on and so forth. So, and those universities haven't really spoken with one another too much. So, hence the importance of data to actually show that yes, we do have an issue systemic racism is a problem at Cambridge, as it is at any university in the UK and abroad. And the first step, definitely what this quote shows, is actually to admit that racism exists, because I mean, this is the first step which allows us to move forward. Next assumption, second assumption that data allowed us to challenge and also to start conversations was that many people thought that actually, well, university is not particularly diverse. There are maybe 10% of all staff are of Black, Asian and minority ethnic background. It's just because, BAME colleagues just do not apply here. It's because applications are so low. But then if you look at data, and this is what this graph shows, I mean, more than 1/3 of applications came from candidates who would self-identify as Black, Asian and minority ethnic. So it's not about applications, it's something that happens here on this line within the process, within the processes of that we have at the university, that there is this high proportion of people who do not make it from application to offer, and we see that I mean, this is completely different for colleagues who apply who are white. Last example, last but not least, it's really a broad, really a broad topic. Is the concept, the assumption is that as a University of Cambridge, or again, it's not just about Cambridge University. I would definitely believe it's all across the sectors. Is that that people thinking that yes, we are a meritocracy. People, if they are willing enough, if they're clever enough, they just can apply, then will be promoted. They will get good grades. Why can't we just be colorblind? Why can't we go past race? But then when you look at data, and these images are just showing you an example of how we can visualize the data to make it more powerful, is that our whole of our leadership team is white. So the first row is our pro-vice-chancellors, including vice-chancellor, and the heads of schools. So how it is that we are a meritocracy, but at the same time our leadership is non-diverse. There is an awarding gap, a 12% awarding gap for Black students, although they are admitted to Cambridge with the same excellent AAA plus grades. So something happens within Cambridge, within the university, that makes experience of Black students affect their performance. Access to leadership courses that are accessed by nomination. We know that BAME colleagues are participating in those courses less. So I'm mindful of time, so I will very briefly go just through 2 slides, just to briefly tell you that we definitely think data is an enabler. Data is really key to identify issues, to openly recognize issues around experiences of racism, around processes of recruitment, promotions, and so on. It's key to monitor change. And it's also key to to avoid perhaps avoiding the excuse to I don't have data, so we can't implement informed actions, so and which then translates into really maintaining the status quo. But actually data can, we discovered, be an obstacle to some extent when working on anti-racism, because in a way, we do not need data to prove that racism exists, because it's out there. I mean, it's lots of data gathered nationally at other universities by academics shows that racism is there. So it's not that we need data to prove that it exists, but more perhaps to find out how exactly it affects my university. What can we change within our processes, within our awareness, mostly awareness of white people, to make difference. the complexity here about, you know, the we need more data approach. So wanting more data as an excuse to not to act. So, oh, you know, we need more focus groups. We need to more surveys. That's, I mean, the value of more and more focus groups is limited. We know what the experiences are. And if you run repeated focus groups to ask about racism, BAME colleagues, BAME students about racism, it is re-traumatizing. It might not really be helpful. And the last but not least, the absence of evidence is not really evidence of absence in this case. When we think, for instance, about reporting racism, as our REC application shows, I mean, in the last 5 years, we only had five formal reports of racism to HR at the university, but we know racism exists. We know colleagues experience racism. So it's not that it's not there. So definitely, I mean, we need to dig deeper than just kind of, you know, stop with data in certain circumstances. So definitely, just running through the last slide to tell you about three actions that are informed by data as a result of our work on Race Equality Charter. We have developed pilot equality dashboards, which are like a suites of data that we will be providing to the heads of schools on a yearly basis to let them know how their specific institutions fare basically in terms of key statistics, in terms of gender and racial diversity, but also in terms of non-disclosure and so on. We are delivering almost weekly race awareness sessions, working with white people to raise awareness, to build allyship, anti-racist allyship skills. And we've developed a guide, a framework for institutions, which includes advice on how to recruit diversely in a transparent and fair manner, which we've shared widely, and which includes kind of very practical advice on what to do at each stage of the recruitment process. So I will stop here, and very happy to take questions if there's time. So apologies for running over. Thank you so much.
Hi, Joanna, thanks very much for a really interesting presentation, and you know, no technical glitches, which is fantastic. So hopefully it'll stay that way, and we can try and just ask a couple of questions. And I suppose I just wanted to kick off before I look at the Q&A section there. Just to say that we recently established a race and ethnicity equality working group in the university. And, you know, we had our first meeting in August, and, you know, we were saying, you know, because we'd been through the Athena Swan process in relation to gender, and so we know how important data is for that process, and, you know, it is the starting point. We felt that was the starting point in relation to race and ethnicity as well. And, you know, but a lot of the feedback we were receiving from the members of the group is what you touched on, that we're collecting more and more data, but just very little action. You know, they say we can look around the university. We know we've very few Black people of colour amongst our employee population, and then you look at our committees and our particular university committees, and zero. People of colour. So they're like, you know, why are you gathering more and more data? Can't we just take action? You know, so what would I say to that? How do we respond to that to get people to understand, you know, the importance of having the data?
I think thank you for this question, Marcelina. I think it's a really important question, because I think there is a balance in acting and gathering data. I think to some extent, it's a fair comment and criticism that, well, at some point we need to stop gathering data, we have to start acting, but actually to be able to start acting in an informed way, you have to have data. I mean, some perhaps areas are really clear. I mean, you might you know, it's really easy to see that, unfortunately, I mean, possibly at your university, at our university, there are really very, very few Black staff members or Black students. So perhaps, I mean, one can start thinking of actions around that area without stopping to collect information on other areas, like, let's say, I mean, it might be a common knowledge that yes, there are less people, less Black, less Asian people in committees, or the, you know, the higher up you go in the from lectureship to professorship, the more white it becomes. But actually, it's really useful to know what happens. So what is it, because it's hard to move from postdoc to lecturer, or is the drop from, I don't know, an associate professor to full professor? Where is the blockage? So I think this is when you know that, it's easier to make an impactful action, to implement something that really matters, because the danger is that you start acting, and nothing happens, because you're doing things that are not really adapted to your institutions. So I think, yeah, I think there is a balance, and it's a tricky question and a complex situation.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. I'm just going to try and get to a couple of the questions here from our delegates as well. So a question has come in, and can you please comment on progress regarding implementing Cambridge's Race Equality Action Plan? Has there been resistance, and how would you characterize progress in implementing actions?
I think actually there is lots of positive and involvement around the action plan. I think the action plan was agreed with all the action owners from all the different parts of the university. So if you scroll through the action plan, there will be people from admissions office, from HR, where our E&D section sits, from you know, departments and non-school institutions, so non-academic departments, and we monitor progress. There obviously are some delays because of COVID and not being able to do things as we used to do, but actually I believe that the progress 1 year since we've got the award is actually quite satisfactory. And the plan is ambitious, and it takes time to, and we are aware that there will be delays. Maybe it is slightly too ambitious, who knows? But actually, the fact that it was ambitious allowed us to, you know, to pave the way and perhaps move forward faster than we would otherwise.
Yeah, thank you. And another one. Is there anything that you would do differently now, having gone through the process? You know, any kind of key learnings?
That's an interesting question. I think that the benefit of our approach was that we started to talk about race and racism fairly early, kind of from the very first meeting of the self-assessment team, which looked after the whole process. So I think that was very positive, and that I wouldn't definitely change. I think where the complexity of Cambridge comes in is that it's a devolved institution. So perhaps thinking from the very beginning how to involve all the institutions that are perhaps slightly further away from the sort of central HR, central university, and how to involve colleges as much as possible, because you may be aware that kind of colleges, there is a collegiate university, but actually each of the 31 colleges is a separate institution. So how to communicate what we're doing, how to communicate the partial results. I would improve that definitely, and hopefully we are making some improvements as we go now.
Very good. And there is another question in relation to, you know, I guess the administrative burden of, you know, going or trying to address the issues within the university one ground at a time. You know, so you have the gender you know, equality charter, then you've got the race equality charter, and then, you know, you've got, you know, 7 other grounds under Irish equality legislation anyway. So you know, is it a huge burden to be trying to address each of these things separately?
Yeah, I mean, it was, I mean, working on the Race Equality Charter definitely was a hugely time-consuming process. I mean, the gathering of data, the analysis of data. But I think that if it was set up differently, if it was set up in a way that we would look at gender and race and disability and all the other protected characteristics at the same time, we wouldn't be able to address racism and, you know, start the conversations about racism as much as it's needed. Because in a way, I mean, the conversations about gender have been quite advanced, and people were sort of are becoming more and more comfortable to talk about gender and sexual discrimination and harassment, while talking about race is still a major problem for people. So I think mixing it with all the other areas, very important as well, I think would possibly prevent us from making progress on that front. And I do realize that there's perhaps at some stage when we are more advanced, people are more comfortable to talk about race, it will be more possible to do to do it more intersectionally, and you know, even starting to doing it intersectionally right now would be important, but without losing the specific issues from your side.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Well, listen, Joanna, thanks very much. I'm going to have to leave it there. I know it's a lot of other questions, so we could have spent the whole morning really on this topic, I think. But it was really interesting, and thanks very much for taking the time to join us. And I hope you can stay on another while and listen to some of the other panelists.
Thank you, Marcelina. Thank you for the questions.
Thank you very much. So I'm now going to move on and introduce our next panelist. And our next panelist is Jackie Fox. And Jackie leads Accenture's security practice in Ireland. And she's over 20 years experience in the industry. And she serves as vice chair on the board of Cyber Ireland and lectures on cybersecurity in UCD. She's an active researcher and public speaker, and was awarded Security Champion of the Year 2018 in Ireland. And she was also named in the EMEA SE 50 Women of Influence in Cyber, which sounds extremely impressive. So thanks very much, Jackie, for joining us. And I know you're going to talk about data security and the various aspects of that. So please go ahead.
Thank you very much for the introduction, Marcelina, and I was delighted to be invited here to speak to everybody today. I'm going to attempt to share my screen here. Hopefully I'll get the right one up, this one. Please shout if you're not seeing it. Can people see that? I presume silence means that you can. I was very interested in Johanna's talk, and actually it's something that's very relevant for cybersecurity, because it's an area where we have a lot of issues kind of around diversity. There are probably about 10 to 12% of people working in cybersecurity are female. And we also have kind of ethnicity issues as well, you know, where there's kind of racial kind of, you know, trying to get people from diverse races involved in cybersecurity is a challenge for us. And I know certainly in Accenture, we tried to tackle this by looking at metrics and counting them, and both on the way in and also in seniority kind of as we go up through the organization. So it was very interesting to hear the discussion earlier. Thank you. So the first thing, sorry, my slides have flown ahead here, bear with me. The first thing that I wanted to just touch on in relation to securing your data is proportionality. And it's something that we see a lot of people having challenges with, because clearly if you are working with data and you have data, you want to use it for some reason, but you want to make sure that it's being used for the right reasons. And there is generally a trade-off between usability of data versus how secure the data is. And I'm going to speak a little bit more about some controls and how that's used. used, but basically, if we want to make data usable for people, you want to make sure that they can get access to it, that you're not making it very cumbersome and making them go through a lot of password kind of blocking things, and having to reset their password every time they go into it, or that the controls that you have there just don't make people give up before they get in and do what it is you want them to do with the data. But also, if we put too many security controls in place, the performance and the usage of that data can be impacted. For example, if we apply kind of very heavy encryption in an inappropriate manner, you can find that the access to the data is very slow or very cumbersome. So we need to use that proportionately and make sure that the controls that we put in place are right. The way we measure security and how we're applying it to data falls under 3 different areas, and we call it the CIA triad, which sounds kind of scary, but it's not. CIA stands for confidentiality, availability, and integrity. And just to give you some examples of that, protecting the confidentiality of the data, this is trying to make sure that we don't end up having a data breach. Availability means trying to make sure that the data is available to the right people at the right time. And we do see a lot of attacks against this, things like a denial of service, where a hacker or some kind of an attacker tries to stop you getting access to your data. So they may just overload a website with lots of different kind of nefarious and useless requests, which block people from doing what they want to do on that website. And the other area that we look at is the integrity of the data. We try to protect that. And a good example of that would be somebody went into their workplace and changed their salary from 10,000 to 100,000, by slipping on an extra zero on the end. So there's lots of instances where we need to protect the integrity of the data and make sure that it's clean and not being destroyed by other people. Now, there's a whole load of different actors in this space who might try to do things against the confidentiality, availability, and integrity of your data. So we see what we call script kiddies, which are people who are playing around, maybe kind of getting to upskill themselves, don't really have great ideas about what they could be doing, and they're showing off to friends. They're often young people or people trying to get into the trade craft. We also see insiders working kind of against data, and this can be accidental or it can be quite deliberate, that they are trying to do something against your data security. And then we also see the more threatening, what we call advanced persistent threat, and this is more of a kind of a government-based threat, perhaps between 2 different countries, where people are trying to get in, steal data, destroy data, or block access to data at a different kind of level altogether. And we've got lots of examples of that happening at the moment, in the media, with crocs of data being stolen from organizations, or where people are trying to influence and actually change the integrity of the data out there. So these are the 3 types of in general terms, the 3 types of individuals who may try to impact the security of your data. Some common types of attacks that we see are phishing, social engineering attacks. I've already mentioned denial of service, and we also see malware going out around the place. So, and I'm going to dig a little bit more into some of those concepts as we go on. So before I talk about the different kind of controls and practices that you can put in place to protect your data, I just wanted to walk through a common attack that we're seeing a lot of in the media today on ransomware. And a lot of you have probably heard of this. It's the idea that somebody gets some malware, injects it into your computer, and then starts encrypting your data so that you no longer have access to it. What we are seeing more and more now is that, as well as actually not allowing you have access to the data, they're actually stealing that data and taking possession of it themselves before they mess it up. So leave alone do you not have access to the data, but somebody else has access to it too. And this tends to put a layer into that bit where they get onto you with the ransom note and say, give me this in Bitcoin, or we won't give you access to the data again. And what's more is we might actually publish that confidential data on top of not allowing you have access to it. And this, we used to see this being quite a random attack where people were just trying to make small amounts of money. So the ransoms were often very small values, like, a couple of €1,000. But now we're seeing that often attackers get into people's networks, look around, decide what the net worth of this organization is and try and balance the ransom request against what they believe that the organization will actually pay. And the leverage of exposing data on top of you not having access to data has really made a lot of people start thinking about, well, actually, should I pay this, even though all advice from law enforcement is that you should not pay it. Reasoning behind that is that it is a much greater threat to have your data exposed. You've got all sorts of regulatory and legal things that you're going to have to work with then, as opposed to just not getting access to it anymore, because if you have a good backup for your data in place, you could clearly put it back up again, and it's an inconvenience. You're offline for a while, but it's much more serious if that data could be breached. So to try and look at putting controls in place to stop people breaking in and breaching your data in some form or another, there are lots of different controls that we see. And I just wanted to kind of briefly touch off 6 of the top 20 Centre for Internet Security controls that are commonly used to judge an organisation, or to help see what the maturity of an organisation is today. So some of those are around understanding your assets, which I'm going to talk in a little bit more detail on another slide, understanding what data assets and hardware assets you have. Also around looking at your vulnerabilities, so scanning your data pots to look and say, well, what are known attack vectors that could be utilized to get to my data, and if I see that I'm exposed to one of those known attack vectors, what can I do to patch or update those systems to make them less vulnerable? Also making sure that people who are privileged users, who might be someone who has access to a back-end database, or somebody who has access to move around large amounts of money in your organization, that they have special levels of monitoring put on them, and that the usage, that people don't give out administrative privileges kind of very easily across accounts. Also securing your hardware and software with known configurations that are known good, so there's not, you can judge against that rather than going and checking off each little thing on each little system. And then making sure that you're monitoring what's happening as well, using what we call incident and event monitoring, which is basically a branch of data analytics which is focused in the security world, and it looks at correlating data from different sources to understand if there are known threats. For example, if I logged into a system in Dublin, and then also my credentials were used to log into a system in Japan within an hour, it's clear that it's not me who's logging into those 2 systems, because I couldn't have traveled that physical location. So therefore, one of those activities is probably nefarious and would need to be inspected further. So there's some of the common controls that get put in place today. And I just wanted to dig into those a little bit further. One of those is around knowing and understanding your assets. And this is something that we've seen a lot of organizations do quite well in as of late, actually, over the last couple of years, mainly because of the general data protection regulation that was brought in and the threat of fines. Made a lot of people look at what data they had. Do they really need it? How long they're keeping it for? And this has impacted, if a breach does occur, hopefully people don't have, years and years and years of data going back that they shouldn't have anymore, or data in relation to customers that, they shouldn't have, or students that they don't have the right to keep information on anymore. So it's looking at that whole life cycle of data, and, should you have it in the first place? What kind of processing are you doing against that data? And when you've finished with it, are you disposing of it appropriately? So this, looking at your organization through a lens like this, helps you to reduce your exposure to breaches and things that could go wrong. Another control that we often use for the protection of data is around identity and access management. And this is a discipline where we look at who has access to what. And is it the person who they say they are? So we're asking someone to present credentials and actually use maybe a password or some kind of biometric authentication, but basically to authenticate that they are the person that they're presenting as. And then when they have presented their credentials, then we're saying, well, what should you have access to? And different people will have access to different things on a system. And we see a lot of creep in this area, where people often gather access to things over the years. And it's very important that there's a cycle put in place to actually review and say, well, is it now appropriate that this person has access to something they needed 5 years ago? They haven't accessed it since, and it doesn't make sense. So cutting down the amount of data that people have access to is a good way of securing data against things going wrong. Even accidental breaches, like somebody attaching the wrong spreadsheet or sending a spreadsheet out to many more people than they intended to, you know, by cutting down the amount of data people have access to, it can make a big difference to potential breaches that happen. One of the other tools that we use a lot in trying to protect data is encryption. And we use this for many, many different things. So we can use it to actually parcel up a piece of data and say, when it left me, there's a code in here that says when it arrives somewhere else, we know it's the same piece of information and that it hasn't suffered from lack of integrity along its journey. We also use this to actually compact data and store it in smaller packages, so it decreases our maybe our cloud storage costs. And we also use it where we're communicating data between one place and another, so that people can't eavesdrop and look on in that data. And this becomes quite relevant, you know, when we're working from home, when we're using Wi-Fi. It's very important that you actually have your Wi-Fi data encrypted so that people walking past your house or in your vicinity can't pop in and have a look and see what you're doing on your network, because it's actually quite easy to do that using off-the-shelf tools. We would see cryptography as being a discipline that is moving very quickly at the moment, with advancements like you know, quantum computing coming in. Some types of cryptography will get broken by that. So there's a lot of people looking at areas like quantum safe computing to make sure that, you know, we can keep this tool in our repertoire on how we protect different types of data. I just wanted to touch briefly off how our attack surface has changed since the advent of everybody working at home. And a lot of this kind of comes down to encryption, whether or not we're using little virtual private networks to log into our organization in a secure manner. A lot of organizations had this facility in place before we all got locked down, but actually other organizations didn't and had to put it in quickly. So they probably need to have a little bit of a look back and see whether or not this is something that they're doing appropriately. We also have had some issues in relation to the collaboration tools, like we're using Zoom platform today, there's Teams, there's lots of other collaboration tools out there, and making sure that we're using the appropriate tool for what we're doing. Clearly there was some issues in the beginning around whether or not people could eavesdrop into conversations. We had Zoom bombing, where people were dropping in onto meetings where they shouldn't be, and you know, putting up data and political statements and all sorts of things. I think that's developed a lot now. We have things like lobbies in place so that we can admit people in and out of meetings, and but just making sure that the platform you pick for collaboration is appropriate to, you know, whether you're having a chat with somebody down the road or whether you're talking about kind of nuclear missile plans. You need to make sure that you've got the right platform, that it's adjusted appropriately. Also making sure that you're aware of who you're actually sharing your networks with, you know, whether you're sharing them with IoT devices, whether your next door neighbors are in on your network, what other members of your family might be doing and what they might be opening up on your network as well are often quite relevant. I'm conscious of time, so I'm just going to skip on to the last slide here. I'm sure people will probably get a copy of the slides at the end so they can read through some of this material at their leisure. One of the things that we do try and do is put up a few rules of the road about how people can protect their themselves and their organizations. So, and there are some different processes that we can use to help with that. One of these is around threat modeling. And this could be as simple as looking at saying, well, you know, I need to work with my colleagues on a collaboration platform between 12 and 1 in the day while I'm sitting working from home, and we don't have great internet bandwidth. So if that's the case, then I probably need to tell everybody else in the family not to be looking at Netflix over that period, because it could have a severe impact on my ability to do my job. So that is a threat to me. Whereas in an organizational level, you might be looking at, exposure of data and all sorts of different types of threats. But again, it comes down to the confidentiality, integrity, and availability from a security perspective. We would also suggest that people make sure that they have appropriate backups in place should they get hit with something like ransomware, and that they're storing data in appropriate places. They should have their network configured properly. They should make sure if they've got IoT devices that they're segmented from their work kind of systems. Make sure that you've got good antivirus software in place so it's continually protecting your devices from the outside world and from the bad actors. Try to keep good password hygiene, use password managers, don't use the same password across multiple sites, make sure your passwords are strong, and also looking at defense in depth so that the controls and the protections that you do put in to manage your data, that if one of them fails, that you might have another one that's going to kind of slot in. So for example, if your password fails, then perhaps you might have the information encrypted, so even if somebody does get in, they can't get access to that. So at this point, I might hand back into the group again, and I don't know if we have time for any questions.
Jackie, hi, it's Rory, back to you again.
Hi, Rory.
Thanks very much. Thanks very much for that presentation. Yeah, of course, there are questions. In fact, there's quite a lot of questions coming in, and I'm just conscious that we're not going to be able to answer all of them, or get our panelists to answer them all, but we'll do our best to accommodate the questions. Jackie, quick question from one, I think the remote working one that you've kind of answered, I think, in terms of what can somebody do when working on sensitive data when they're working from home, sort of tips around that.
I think one of the first things that it's very important that people look at their environment around them. So if they're, if they're in a shared environment where, like, a lot of people are not sharing houses with family, they're sharing kind of living spaces with people that they don't know very well often. So to make sure that the environment you're working from is appropriate. And so let's say, kind of if you're in a shared area and there's other people in the room, they could be listening to you. It's as simple as that. And also positioning of your screen. If you're working in a downstairs room, you've got sensitive information on your screen. People could be walking past or coming up and down your drive or looking in windows, and making sure that you're not exposing, verbal and visual information. Then from a technological perspective, making sure that your router, your Wi-Fi and all those sort of things are up to date and patched. And that you allow patches also onto your laptop or your desktop or whatever you're using, that you make sure that's up to date and that you've got good antivirus software. So they would be my main kind of tips for working from home.
Thanks, Jack. Just one question that just has come into my mind, and it seems to be kind of an emerging theme from some other questions. There seems to be a conflict in some ways between, access to data, demand for access to data, right, and then who actually controls the data. So certainly from what I'm hearing from you, the less people obviously that can control the data, the less risk there is of data breaches. So just what's your view on that? I mean, obviously data is really, really important, and if people can understand data across an organization, it can affect change. But if there's only very few people that can control the data, what do we do about that?
That's a really good question. I suppose there's two ways that I would kind of break that down. One is that somebody has to be the ultimate owner of the data in an organization, and then other people are processing the data. So if you own the data, you need to take responsibility in your organization to say, what are we collecting in the first place, and who's going to allow access to that? And it doesn't mean that the data owner, let's say it's the chief financial officer or somebody who, they're not going to be doing this every day of the week and saying you can have it and you can't. They would delegate that authority to somebody, but it's very important that somebody actually takes responsibility for the data that you have and who is getting access to it. So that's the first thing about ownership of the data. But then down to the processing element, it's very important that people are educated about what's reasonable and what's not, because having a set of data doesn't mean that you can do what you like with it. You need to have, particularly if there's personal data in there, you need to have informed the data subjects what kind of processing you're going to be doing, and you can't go outside that. So if you said, I'm collecting your data in order to provide you with information about curtains or something, you can't then go and try and sell that person a new car with that data, or you can't analyze it or process it in a different way. And I think quite often where you have mature organizations that have been dealing with the data for a long time and have been, reaping the benefits and the rewards of data, sometimes it's difficult to balance, the mindset of the data analytics. What can we do with this data? This is amazing, and all the business benefits, for an organization and maybe the consumers or the people who are, at the other end of that, versus what you actually have permission to do. So it's up to the data owner to put those rules of the road in place and try and make sure that people who are processing that data are well educated about what's acceptable and what's not acceptable.
Thank you. That's a great answer, Jackie. Thanks for that. Just in terms of, I'm conscious of time as well, and we did start slightly late with everybody signing in. So just on behalf of us all, Jackie, I'd like to thank you for that presentation. Hopefully you get a chance to stay and hear some more of the contributors. At this point, we had planned to take a 10-minute break. I'm going to ask people to come back in 5 minutes because we're running a little bit over. I want to try and get stick to the timelines. So if everybody could come back at 11:15, that would be great. I look forward to seeing you then. Thank you.
Thanks very much for having me.
Thanks, Jackie. Thanks very much. Welcome back, everybody. Hope you had a little bit of time there for a cup of tea at least. Unfortunately, no Danish is in this house this morning. The next speaker I'd like to introduce is Dr. Vanessa Ho, and Vanessa is Associate Dean for Culture, Development and Inclusion and Reader in Pharmacology and Inclusive Practice at St. George's University of London. She is also co-lead for Athena Swan and led on data collection and analysis in the successful institutionally Athena Swan Silver Award submission. Besides conducting laboratory research that focuses on novel signaling molecules in the circulation, Vanessa has a diverse teaching portfolio that includes curriculum development of undergraduate and postgraduate biomedical degrees, and until recently, organisation of student support. Vanessa's roles at St. George's make for an interesting mix of education, research, and equality and diversity activities. But a core theme in her work is about evidence use for better understanding and a more inclusive working and learning environment. So please join me in welcoming Vanessa to talk to us this morning about the importance of data and strong analytics for Athena Swan applications. Thanks, Vanessa.
Thank you. I'm hoping technology is on our side. Can everybody hear me okay? Brilliant. And thanks for that kind introduction. It's always interesting to hear my own bio being read, sort of realise what I'm trying to do. So I'm absolutely delighted to be here. So thanks very much for the invitation. Really focusing on Athena, and what I'm going to try to do, really just share some of our experience with you. As you would appreciate, with any charter marks or any diversity inclusion work, we're going to have very different approaches. So what might have worked for us in a particular St. George's setting might not necessarily work for you, but I'm quite keen to share the experience and very happy to connect and maybe extend our discussions beyond today's conference. So very happy to receive messages after this, particularly if I'm not able to address your questions. So perhaps to set the scene, and this is when I've already forgotten to share my desktop, which is a brilliant start. So just want to set the scene, because I think my view about a lot of diversity inclusion work, the context is awfully important. So for us, George's is located in southwest London, and it's actually my background. So it's a particularly diverse area that we're located in, and that you would expect to be reflected in our student and staff membership. We also are a specialist institute in the sense that we focus for our education and research activities. We focus on biomedical science, medicine and healthcare subjects. So it's a particular setting. In fact, we are the only independent medical school in the UK. So what that means is that you might expect a medical school within a larger university where you might have things like physics, chemistry, etc. We don't have that. We really focus on biomedical science and medicine and healthcare allied subjects. And that has implications for our data and how we interpret our data, and perhaps what staff are more comfortable with in terms of handling data. For Athena, which is what I'm focusing on today, we have always taken an institutional approach. So while we have multiple academic institutes within the university, we have not gone for the departmental awards. So we like the cross-institutional approach while supporting sort of any local initiatives and pay attention to any local needs and differences across the academic institutes within it. So we obtained our institutional silver in 2018, and that's really a combination of quite a bit of a journey for a number of years, but I think particularly from 2015, when we first attempted to get a silver award at the institutional level. And that was after about a year or so after a major restructure. So we completely restructured our academic institutes within the university, but we thought we had been progressing along reasonably well, so we thought we'd try for silver. Obviously, the Athena panel at the time thought otherwise, And we were really quite devastating with the outcome. And I'll just leave you maybe a moment to read through this particular response from the Athena panel. So I guess that, I mean, obviously we received other feedback, and they are usually really quite constructive. So we were directed to essentially where our shortfalls were, and I guess I've highlighted it here. Essentially, we didn't know what we're doing. We're not too aware of our issues, at least on paper. I think we were able to identify some of the issues and develop targeted actions, but we really didn't showcase and did ourselves justice in the application. And I think quite disappointingly, we weren't able to, it seems, to evidence progress. And that's really where the data came from. And we really then reflected on this response and trying to see where we could have done better. And I think it was sometime, maybe within a year after this unsuccessful attempt, I got more involved in terms of the leadership and also took over all things data, in a way to get advantage of my somewhat quantitative background as a pharmacologist, so that I might have been, or the perception is that I might be more comfortable with the numbers, and therefore help to have a fresh look at things and see how we can use evidence better. So one of the things I really advocated from the get-go was a very clear mapping of our data needs. So it's about not just about the requirements from Athena, and it's quite a long list of requirements, so basic headcounts, proportion, gender split for promotion, pipeline, levers, etc. So it's quite a long list of requirements, but it's to map it with our structure, then newer structure, and really look into our needs, and then interrogate what type of data we're talking about. And immediately it was very clear that we were interpreting the word data differently. So because of our discipline, I think a lot of staff and also students were really thinking about numbers, and that's kind of showcased in a lot of the applications as well, because rooms and rooms of tables, bar charts, line graphs, etc. So we were perhaps omitting the importance of the qualitative side, which really provides the context for those numbers, if we do have those. We were, I think, perhaps not clear enough about the use of internal versus external data. So here, I think I'll interpret the word external quite broadly again. So if you were thinking about a departmental an award, then external could be just simply external to your department rather than external to your university. And you can even go more granular than that, and could be certain data, qualitative or otherwise, external to a particularly large research group or educational group, or a degree educational team, for example. And I think, as already alluded to in the talks before, is an important focus on inclusion. We situate in quite a diverse area of London and the UK in general, so it's not too difficult to showcase diversity by headcounts. So in terms of proportion of students who might be women or men, depending on the degree courses, and staff likewise. But it's the inclusion that's really difficult to showcase, and perhaps we didn't shout about it in the application as much. So by inclusion, I'm really focusing on people's experience. So do people feel that they're actually being included? They're represented by numbers, but are they included in terms of access to opportunities? Are they being encouraged and supported to even apply when opportunities do present themselves? And those are more difficult to get at. And that tends to rely on qualitative data and maybe starting from anecdotal comments and connections that your EDI team might make. And with that, I'll maybe perhaps respond to a question that's already come up in the Q&A sessions, a question about other means of collecting data beyond surveys. So I just referred to qualitative data there, and I see that much more broadly than surveys. Response rates can be low. I think one example that sort of more digging into data, it's about levers, destinations, so where people go, because we strongly believe that it's not just about our internal pipeline. We would love to retain talents and support people to go up the ladder, so to speak, which is a terrible term because we know that it's not linear, but to support people within St George's, but is to understand that there are wider sector issues, particularly fixed term contracts for researchers. Almost inevitably they would have to go elsewhere in some cases for career development, but it's important to then know where they've gone to. Now that's quite difficult to capture because like many other universities, we have a system of exit surveys and exit interviews, but the uptake tends to be low, and that's not a St George's problem. It's a challenge that many of us face. So what we've done is actually quite simply email request. So we look into what we really want to ask the local departments or academic institutes, kind of a simple table, and ask them as much as possible, fill in the gaps, please. These are the levers we know who have left the past 3 years. Do you have any information at all where they've gone to, so that we can match that up with maybe more patchy data that we collected systematically? So that, and this is one example that we try to match up more local intelligence with any systematic mechanisms or instruments that we have, because they do tend to have gaps, either because of inaccuracies or just simply people didn't provide the information, or that a line manager omitted to log those on when somebody's left or for other reasons. So I would suggest that as one approach. So it's very much depending on the structure, understanding the local needs. So we do a lot more work around that and beyond any systematic instruments. So I hope that to some extent answers the question, but happy to pick that up again when time allows. So with the data mapping, we really interrogate what we had and then what we could get more, actually asking a lot more people and engaging more people, particularly expertise that are kind of hidden in the different departments and institutes, and those sitting outside of the self-assessment team that Athena had. Many of us got quite a large assessment team, good representation, but they are not necessarily in an operational role that assist them to provide the data or look for the data for the team. So it's really broad engagement. So we changed the approach to data. We redefine what data means to us, and occasionally I change the word. Rather than data, I refer to it as information or evidence because of the misconceptions about what data mean in terms of Athena. That seemed to have worked. So this was the main response from the Athena panel for our successful application at the end of 2017. Obviously delighted with the response, but it really shows the importance of data. We're all here today, so I think we recognize that already, but this is a particular example of how important that is. It's not just about fulfilling the basic requirements of data in the Athena form, so it's not formulaic that way, but it's to showcase that you understand the context of your department or university, to show the impact, and therefore deriving from that proactive actions. So I hope I've convinced you how important data really are, and perhaps share some tips and challenges that we've faced still. So we've changed a lot, and we work on that, involving a lot more people than before. For Athena application, these are the data purposes that you might see: the role for data, evidencing decisions, actions, monitoring progress, impact, etc. So it's really a core part of the whole iterative process of driving change. What I would add there is that I would say data should be part of the communication strategies. I don't mean sending out your quite detailed tables, charts to everyone who might have expressed interest. It's just a hint of an understanding. So if you try to set up a workshop or some sort of world cafe to gather more information and local intelligence about something, you can show maybe the basic gender ratio or some data indicating that why you are setting those targeted actions, so that you encourage engagement. And that's been really quite fruitful for us, even just adding a few pieces of evidence in our internal communications for people to sign up for events. So that's what we've found really helpful. And to just give you some concrete examples, so I'm just going to use two in particular that, as already mentioned before, is quite, it's not so straightforward all the time, but it's relatively easy to try to get a head count. It might be in the HR system. You do need to check for accuracy with local staff, but then you would generally have a gender ratio for many things. But there might be cases where you want to dive a little bit deeper. So this is a particular example. We obviously want to look at academic pipeline, so the snapshot of how many people are in our lecturers, senior lecturers, readers, and professorial levels. That's our academic ranks, if you like. And we look at academic promotions. The numbers between genders are comparable usually. Success rates fluctuate, obviously, but comparable. But we didn't think that there was no issue with it, because anecdotally, we were starting hearing comments about actually people were equally successful, but women tend to wait for a longer period before they would attempt to apply. This is not uncommon. I think there's plenty of research about that for recruitment, in terms of wanting to tick all the boxes before you attempt an application. And that might be the case for promotion. So, but we really wanted data to substantiate that and then justify the targeted actions and more workshops for people to engage and maybe try to explore why that might be the case. So this little graph took us an awful long time and a lot more people involved to dig out, because this is about the time needed, or essentially the delay for people to achieve successful promotion for the next step. So, and you can compare the green and the gray. So it is confirming that our women senior lecturers are taking a lot longer to achieve readership, and to say less extent, but also obvious the same for professorial applications. And that was very striking to us. So that addressed, and that responded to those who thought that actually there was no issue at all about academic promotion. So that led us to establish more supporting system, some buddy schemes, more workshops, and actually more proactive actions in identifying potential candidates for promotion. So digging a bit deeper, if at all possible, it's just so important, but recognizing also that this is labor intensive. This is another example where we were trying to use data to showcase a cultural change, which is really quite difficult to do. And we thought one area was about decision-making committees. So we have many decision-making committees, many more other committees too, and we look at the gender ratio across the board. And this is one way that we've presented our data, is to show collectively how that's changed and achieve more or less gender balance. We're not necessarily aiming for 50%, because our overall gender ratio is about 60% female at St. George's, but they are now more consistent to start with, and now more representative of our staff membership. Particularly, I think there was an outlier of 0%. I think there was a finance department, finance committee for that. So obviously understanding that there are going to be fluctuations about gender ratio in small committees, but to look at things holistically in this way, we found it really quite useful. But that involved an awful lot of email exchanges, trying to ascertain all the decision-making committees and the memberships, and our memberships are quite fluid. But once we got these data, as a result of very conscious action to change the composition. So right now we've maintained this level with deliberate open spaces for certain committees where people can apply irrespective of their operational role and seniority. We also have observers places for very senior committees as well. So that's really opened up our membership, but also to transparency. So it builds trust and improve transparency across the board and better understanding of what Athena is about, particularly with our discipline, with at least currently still the link to clinical research funding from NIHR, National Institute of Health Research. For some in the sector, it was seen as box ticking, and while in practice really isn't. So that understanding and transparency and sharing of some of the headline data was important. I was getting ahead of myself there, but I think it would be remiss of me not to mention the challenges that are involved. And this is how I imagine some of my colleagues kind of look like behind their computers when they received yet another email from me with some sort of data request. But the message is really about clarity of what data you're asking. Actually define data, at least to start with, what you're asking to, and the purpose of those data. So we had quite a few 4 starts, and as demonstrated by our initial and successful application. These are some of the different things that we've identified as being quite a helpful approach. For us in particular, with our discipline, defining data is important, but with the understanding there's going to be capacity issues. There might be expertise issues because you might be asking questions in the type of data that nothing is in place to collect. So it might be quite a manual job for somebody, and that takes time and maybe it would benefit from you or some other members of your team to sit through with them to explain what you really need for diversity inclusion actions. And I would just want to say something about benchmarking, because it's not been mentioned before yet, but it's hinted at about externality of some of the data. For us, we were criticized at some point. We were aware that we wanted to have very specific, discipline-specific insights, because that context is important to us, and particularly for our sort of specialty focus. This is not a comprehensive list of degrees that we provide, but it's just to select them to prove a point. So particularly by healthcare related subjects, somewhat like social care sciences and some art subjects, is predominantly female. And it's nationwide, it's our student cohort and our staff and nationally registered healthcare professionals as well, to the tune of about 85%, at some point 90%. So that gives the context so that either the reviewers of your applications, or at least internally, people understand that those areas are going to take perhaps longer to change, to improve, so that we set more realistic expectation for change. So changing our brochure and the representation of students and more gender balanced of student ambassadors involved are not going to suddenly overnight change the composition of our student cohort. So for some areas, it's going to be a very slow cycle. For us, there are also complications about clinical and non-clinical staff because we have a medical school and we have a lot of clinical research staff as well. That means that some things are out of our control. So we can't change NHS pay as an example. So pay gap is a different beast that we tackle with. But what I'm trying to say is that it's important to identify what comparisons you can make. And that might mean proactively contacting other departments or faculty in another university to share, to collaborate, and maybe even obtain some data, which is what we did. Because it would not be appropriate for us to compare to simply another university with a medical school because of the difference in scale. So I guess that's what I'm trying to illustrate, is that rather than data is definitely a good starting point, but it runs in parallel. So the collection and analysis of it runs in parallel with all the other actions that you would have. And it's really to keep the momentum and things going. What we're trying to do is a wholesale analytical approach. So not just about numbers, but various things that are involved. And other speakers already highlighted some of the limitations. And I think I would stress the labor intensiveness of some of this work and actually try to look at resources if possible. But people understanding of what your limits are, but they're happy to assist. So as a wrap up, and I think that's kind of a mission of mine, is that we work in diversity inclusion, but perhaps this can be interpreted as evidence, data, and insight as well. And that's what we're trying to put it at the core of not just Athena, but all of our diversity inclusion activities. So thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Vanessa. I know there's a lot to get through in that short period of time. I hope you can hear me okay.
Yes, I can.
Great. So there was just a couple of questions, and we'd be great if we could to get through those. So the first question is, how did you demonstrate that you'd analysed data to ascertain trends and identify gender equality challenges and opportunities, rather than simply describing data or the policies and procedures?
It's really important questions. I think we still grapple with that. I think, I guess this is being asked in particularly in context of the application of Athena itself. Would that be correct?
Yes.
I think in the narrative, so on a very practical note, the narrative is that if your data presentation is self-explanatory, you do not need to describe them really at all, and go straight to analysis, which essentially what the data actually mean. And you can directly link that to action. So let's say you have somewhat gender imbalance in committee membership, rather than describing the fact that there's imbalance, you might mention what you've done to interrogate the reasons behind those imbalance, and therefore actions that would address them directly. So for us, we identified with that huge range of variations of gender ratio. So identified that there was some in particular with an issue. We then identified that that's because of gender imbalance in the operational role. So that linked up to occupational segregation, because we were at the time more likely to have certain members of staff in say a state or finance role. Then we can then demonstrate why we've opened up some of the membership to incorporate that, because it's slower to change operational representation, because people that are in the job, and if your departments only have one head of department or two deputies, you can't, well, there would be no opportunities to really change that, apart from more job shadowing or then opening up committees. So that's what I think people would like to see in terms of analysing the data. So the reason why behind that, and then straight on to any potential targeted actions.
Okay, and just one other quick question then, how do you count the time to achieve promotion? Do you start counting from the time of their previous promotion, or when the first applied?
From the previous promotion. So that's an excellent question. So it is possible that they might have applied and were unsuccessful. So if you do pick that up or suspect that, that's a sort of further analysis that we need to do. The data that I used were between appointments, essentially, because that's still labour intensive, but easier to put out because of the change in job title. Most HR system would have the start and stop date, and that's where you can calculate time.
Okay, very good. And I just have one last question for you. You know, all of the Irish institutions who have, I think it's one awards, they're bronze, and so a lot of us the next time around will be applying for silver. And is there a big difference in terms of the applications? I know impact and all of that really features in the silver application. So just very briefly, I suppose, what's your take on that, the difference between the two?
Big difference. I think you already highlighted is that impact, but is to then reflect on where the areas of impact might be, and importantly to demonstrate that, and that's really difficult. We found that very challenging. We still find that challenging, and the fact that Avanzik, she distinguishes between progress and impact. So progress might be that you're able to complete a particular action point. Impact might be what I was referring to as hint of cultural change, better feedback, or people feeling more inclusive by whatever means or other instruments of data collection. that's difficult. That's difficult.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, as we thought. Yeah. So, thanks very much, Vanessa. Again, really insightful, and we're delighted to have you here. And if you can stay tuned in, that'll be brilliant. But if
Yeah,
you have
do.
to, that's no problem. So
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. So we'll just move on now to our next speakers. And so I'm delighted to introduce members of our own institution here in UCD, who are going to talk about some of the I suppose best practice or good practice that we've been carrying it out here in the university. So I'd like to introduce you to Tom Costello. First of all, he's the EDI project officer here in our university, and Tom was one of the main organisers of the conference today as well, so he was very busy. So Tom joined the EDI unit just over a year ago, and he's been very much involved in leading out on our data, our EDI data, amongst many other things. And he's a member of the newly formed HEA data group as well. And he has over 15 years experience in data analytics and worked in many private sector organizations as well. We're also going to have Dr. Barbara Fleming, who's going to talk about a best practice in the area of access and lifelong learning. So Barbara is Deputy Director of Access and Lifelong Learning. She works with a team of access experts who support underrepresented groups in UCD. And her work includes student support, development of part-time programs, and the university access programs. And she's with us today to describe the work of access and lifelong learning in using institutional data to measure and communicate diversity across the university. So very valuable work being carried out there in access and lifelong learning as well. But first up, we'll have Tom, and then followed by Barbara. So thank you, Tom.
Perfect. Hi, everyone. I hope everyone can hear me. If you just want to bear with me a few moments, I'm just going to get up my slides. Okay, so as Marcy said, my name is Tom, and I am one of the 2 project officers within the UCD's EDI unit. My background is in data analytics, so I've been very lucky to be involved in some of the more recent initiatives within the university, which of course helps us get a clearer view of the diversity makeup of our community within UCD. So I am conscious I only have 7 minutes and not 7 hours to discuss some of the initiatives we're currently working on. So the plan is to give you a super high level tour of some of our core systems we use to enhance our data collection. Okay, so if you look at the first slide, broadly speaking, there are 3 categories of people within the university community we focus in on when we're collecting data. So the first one is the applicants, and by applicants, I mean staff applicants. Then we move over to our existing employees of the university, and we also collect data on our student cohort. So the first tool I'm going to bring you through is our diversity monitoring tool, which is our tool that was introduced in the university back in late 2013, early 2014. So this is where we invite our applicants to provide their diversity information across the equality grounds. The tool itself is completely anonymous and it is voluntary. This allows us greater visibility of the diversity makeup at applicant stage and through the various stages of our recruitment process. We've used the data to help us refine our equality objectives within the recruitment process. The data we're hoping also will be used in the very near future to roll out some gender-related targets that will help us address some gender imbalances that can exist at the recruitment stage. It also helps us feed into the university's policies and also helps us in the EDI unit meet some of our objectives. In terms of uptake, if you look at the graph there, we initially had a full completion rate of around 20%. So you can see it kind of went from 17, 16, 19, 20 down to 19. But in 2019, we actually moved the screen, putting it in a more predominant position and making it more user-friendly. Since then, you can see our full completion rate jumped to 36%, and now we're currently running at a 58% full completion rate. So the next screen I want to talk to you about is our employee self-service diversity screen. Now, with this, we're hoping to roll this out in the autumn of this year. And up until now, we really haven't had a system for gathering data in relation to existing employees in the way the diversity monitoring tool allows us at applicant stage. So to combat that, what we have been doing is we've been relying heavily on surveys. So surveys like our culture engagement survey and our very own EDI survey would provide us the data on the diversity makeup of our employees. So we're hoping to roll out the screen, like I said, in autumn. We here in the EDI unit have partnered with UCD's HRIS team in the development of this tool. And it is going to be the first time the university will be able to gather data across all 9 equality grounds for existing employees. Now, the hope is this tool the tool itself is also voluntary, I should point out, and it is fully GDPR compliant, and it's anonymous as well. Now, what we're hoping with the tool is that it will encourage a culture shift where employees will feel safe to disclose sensitive information of this kind. Now, the data as well that we're going to capture from the tool, we're hoping that it will give us a much clearer picture of the diversity makeup of the UCD's staff community, and it will also help us refine our policies to support our protected groups within the university. Now, we're very conscious that the success of this tool relies heavily on employee engagement, as well as buy-in across all levels of the university. So what we've done in the EDI unit, we have actually developed a comprehensive communication strategy to support the launch in this autumn. And so we're hopeful that the completion rate, so our full completion rate of this tool, will mirror what we're seeing in our diversity monitoring tool itself. So the next one I'm going to bring you through is I'm going to talk very briefly about our gender analytics tool, which has been designed to support schools within the university when they're preparing for their Athena Swan application. Now, prior to the launch of the tool, schools had to manually gather gender-related data themselves, going to our HRIS team within UCD. So this led to a lot of bespoke reporting and once-off reporting. And as everyone who has been through the Athena Swan process knows very well, it is quite time-consuming. Now, the gender analytics tool itself is a centralized data portal which allows easy access to data needed for the Athena Swan application at school level. We have restricted access to the tool just to heads of school, college principals, and Athena Swan chairs. So what's next for us on the gender analytics tool? Now, the plan is this autumn, we're going to be rolling this tool up to college and university level. We're also planning to expand the tool to include a wider range of diversity details, including ethnicity, to support not only the Athena Swan University application, but also to help us with further HEA initiatives. Now, in terms of student diversity data, we really rely on a combination of reporting. So we use data coming from student registration, and we also use data coming from our our student surveys as well, our EDI student surveys. So students are invited, again, which is completely anonymous and voluntary, just to provide their diversity details. My final slide is just going to show, we have already discussed some of the usages of the data we capture. I'm going to add a couple more usages that we do. So it does support the production of our EDI annual report. It also feeds into the university's gender equality action groups, also the university's EDI group and all its subgroups. As I mentioned earlier, it supports the University and Schools Athena Swan application. It also supports university and the EDI strategies, policies and initiatives. And also it supports the University Gender Equality Action Plan. So that's me. I'm now going to hand you over to my colleague, Dr. Barbara Fleming, who's from Access and Lifelong Learning, and she's going to share with you some of the initiatives that they're working on as well.
Okay, thanks, Tom. So I'm just going to share my screen with you now. Now, as Tom and others noted, I am from Access and Lifelong Learning. So our interest in data is quite different, and I'll just explain what I mean by that. Okay, so there we go. So in terms of diversity, UCD has roughly a third of our students come from underrepresented groups. And data is critical for us in terms of how we communicate our ambitions. So UCD in the last number of years has established key performance indicators. So we've been gathering data on student participation and progression for several years. And a lot of this work is based heavily on the work of Maura McGinn, our Director of Institutional Research. So that data collection is one of our priorities, and it's the priority of the WP Widening Participation Committee, because it allows us to measure our impact. So for us, it's really important that we can share that data. But I think what's a little bit different about how we use data is that what we're looking to do is to share data with people who are not data experts and need some support and guidance in how to interpret the data. So at a very early and crude stage, we introduced the idea some years ago of UCD as a village, so that we would be able to show colleagues, if UCD, for example, was a village of 100 people, how many of those would have a disability or be mature or be part-time or be on low income. And that has really helped us try and convey what we're doing. So over the last number of years, we've really enhanced the kind of metrics that we now use. And what was critical, and it's a little bit like Tom described earlier, it was important for us to be able to develop coherence and join the dots. And Tom referred to kind of bespoke reports being offered before, and that was very much the case up to some years ago, where individuals were gathering separate data on particular equity groups. So what we started was to develop across the 6 main areas. So we're interested in who is participating anonymously, who is participating, including gender, what are the admissions patterns that we have here in UCD. Most recently, what are the outcomes for students who come through an access path, and what is their progression like? We're also interested in the proportion of access students who are involved in outward mobility, and what are their completion rates like? So in very simple ABC terms, myself and my colleague Lisa Padden, first of all, we determined what the trends and patterns were for future planning. So what is happening? And then we looked at that progression and completion data. And finally, we broke those data into the equity groups that our National Access Office has established. The path that students came in, so did they come in a specific, we have 7 paths here in UCD. So did they come in through one of those particular access pathways? What program is the student on? And in terms of workload, are they full-time or are they taking other part-time credit load? And how does that compare to the overall university population? So we've started using particular tools to help us convey this in a very simple way to our colleagues across the university. So we can show our colleagues what the overall national target is, which is defined there as the blue line. And the yellow proportion is the proportion of students that are from our target groups, so that we can see what progress we're making towards hitting the national targets. And we can share then relative to whether students are from a socioeconomic low-income household, whether they have a disability, whether they're mature part-time, or came through what we call a QQIFET route. And we've now also started tracking refugee asylum seekers. So we can see here an anonymized looking program, what this would then look. So it's not enough to tell our colleagues how we're doing campus-wide, but we also share with them how their program is relative to the proportions of students in each group in their program. And this helps them organize and plan for future targets and admissions. You can see here's another example. So the first one I showed you, excuse me, I went through that very quickly. The first group I showed you, you can see a program that is exceeding the target over time. And in this, you can see that there is a proportion there that the target is modest relative to the national line. And you can see it is that there's a fair bit of work to be done there. Most recently, we've started reporting on gender in relation to students, which is supporting a lot of the work that was reported on earlier. So we can see what patterns of participation there are in each of the groups. And we now have an initiative in admissions where previously, again, in a fragmented way, we had targets for each of the subgroups of the equity group. So we had a target for students with a disability, target for students who came through the HERE route and so on. And what we're able to do now with this data is agree with the university community that we would generalize the quota so that if we don't meet the target in offers in one group, we can use those places elsewhere. So the data has really helped us with that argument. So what? So I mean, what is the relevance of data to our work? Well, for us, data is being used to strengthen and demonstrate the value and impact of our work in access and lifelong learning here in UCD. And equally, it's helping UCD describe our work in access. Our next ambition would, if we could have live regularly updated centralized portal that would show, at the moment the data is captured, it's a snapshot in time, but our aspiration would be to have that updated regularly. We will continue to democratize the data because there's no point in us just having the data. We will continue to be able to share it with colleagues in schools, and we would aim to publish that data. We're already sharing it with the Widening Participation Committee here in UCD, but ideally we would like to be able to publish that with enhanced graphics. So that is essentially, that gives you a very brief overview of the work that myself, Lisa Padden and colleagues are doing in relation to data with students. Thanks, Rory.
Thanks, Barbara, and thank you, Tom, as well. And I think thanks to everybody. There's Maura McGinn has been mentioned, and Dr. Lisa Padden has been mentioned as well by colleagues here, just to recognise the really good work that's going on in UCD and quite frankly across the sector as well in this whole area. We are stuck for time, but you know I am conscious that there may well be some questions, but just a general one that I have around this whole area is with regard to you know, data is very sensitive, as we know, and some of the data that you guys are collecting, you can only collect it on the basis of either people self-service in terms of some of the tools that Tom mentioned there, or get their permission. I suppose the big question is, you know, we've seen some good evidence of increase in people sharing their data. How can we improve that? You know, and is it reliable as well? Are the figures that we have, can we stand over them as representative of the entire population within the university?
That's a question for Maura, I'm assuming.
Yeah, I can answer that one. Yeah, we take these from our census of the student record. So the pathways that we take, so for the representation of the different pathways, that's the way the student enters the university. So it's very specific criteria. And it's the full population. It's not a survey population. There are elements of it, and the HEA do a survey of entrants that look at some of the different metrics, so like for social class or for some of the disability areas, and some of that survey data won't be as robust as the pathway data that we have, but certainly we're looking at census data, so that to me for the student side of things is very, very complete.
Yeah, I mean, because I know certainly, you know, and Ross is our next speaker, Dr. Ross Woods, just in terms of census data, you know, in the whole area of race and ethnicity, you know, the consistency around that in terms of defining what's meant by race within the Irish context. There's been a debate around that for quite some time. I think we do have a data set around that, or a definition around that now as well, Maura, isn't that the case?
We're using the Central Statistics Office definition, so the same question that goes on our census population. I think we like that as well, because then we can see what our profile is compared to the national profile, or even to a regional profile within the census. So we're quite, that's good, but that is collected based on a survey. So the student isn't completing that piece of data as they register, so it's not a full census. So the particular one on ethnicity is difficult. It and a few of the other grounds are collected by the survey instrument rather than as part of the registration process.
Okay, just to say, folks, you know, the colleagues on screen here have put up their contact information. You know, if anybody's interested in hearing more about I suppose the very good practices going on in these areas, please feel free to reach out and contact the colleagues on the screen. I'm sure everybody would be happy to share information with other people around that. So I'd just like to thank you guys for your time. And at this point, we have a break, and a scheduled break of 10 minutes, but I'm going to ask people to come back in 5 if that's okay, because we started late this morning and we haven't caught up on time, and I am conscious I want people to finish up on time. So we'll come back in 5 minutes if that's okay. So we come back at about just after 12:10 if that's okay. Thank you. Welcome back, everybody. Our next speaker is Dr. Ross Woods. I'm delighted to welcome Ross to this conference. Ross and Marceline and Tom and myself discussed this conference going back months and months, a long time pre-COVID times. And as I said at the start of the conference, originally we did intend to have this as a big face-to-face event. But anyway, we are where we are. And I would like to welcome Ross to virtual UCD. And Ross is the Senior Manager of the Higher Education Authority's Centre for Excellence for Gender Equality. The centre was established in June 2019, to ensure sustainable acceleration towards gender equality in Irish HEIs by providing centralised support for the institutions, sharing of good practice and funding for innovative organisational and cultural change initiatives nationally. Prior to taking up his position at the HEA, Ross was a Stakeholder Engagement Manager at Quality and Qualifications Ireland and spent a number of years as Senior Lecturer in Spanish at Victoria University of Wellington, New Zealand. Delighted to welcome you, Ross. Ross is going to speak to us about general HEA update matters around target setting, data collection on ethnicity, priorities for the Centre for Excellence, and Athena Swan and the SALI initiative as well. So Ross, I'll hand over to you. Thank you.
Thanks, Rory. Thanks very much. Can you hear me okay?
I hear you loud and clear. Yeah, thanks, Ross.
Okay, great. Okay. So as Rory said, this particular talk was supposed to take place in March. So our initial conversations about an update were kind of to look at what the plans were for the year ahead for the Centre for Excellence for Gender Equality and so on. Obviously, things have changed quite a lot since then. So I've rejigged the talk to try and better reflect where we are now, and to give reasonable information to those listening. So I kind of the HEA update in quotation marks, but really what I was hoping to talk about today was the really the national data collection context, and then also a little bit about target setting, but also to give everyone a brief, for those who are unfamiliar with the centre, just a quick overview of who we are and what we do, because I know there are a lot of people here today who wouldn't necessarily know me or know the centre, and then just touch on some of our priorities for 2020, 2021. Not all the priorities, but just some that I think are relevant for today. And then also give everyone a brief update on the Athena Swan Charter in Ireland, where which has been a focus of some of the talks today. And apologies if I go over ground that's already been covered. I wasn't able to join till about 11:30, so apologies to any speakers who came before me if I repeat some stuff. So first off, the centre itself is based in the HEA and was established on the back of the Department of Education and Skills Gender Action Plan 2018 to 2020. And you can see here the way we operate is that we oversee a framework for gender equality in Irish higher education, which has a number of different strands. You can see one of which is our collection of staff data by gender. Other pieces of work that we do revolve around HEI reporting on recommendations in the 2016 HEA Gender Equality Review and the aforementioned 2018 Action Plan. We have oversight of the Athena Swan Charter in Ireland. We offer the Secretariat for a National Committee for Gender Equality, which is made up of the Vice Presidents for Equality, Diversity and Inclusion across the system. And then we run other initiatives such as the Senior Academic Leadership Initiative, or the SALI, as you may know it. So that's really where we are. As Rory said, we've only been around for a year or so. But even at that, some of you may know that new Minister for Further and Higher Education, Research, Innovation and Science has recently signalled his desire to expand our remit into broader EDI, which I think is more in line with what is happening in institutions anyway. So the HEA welcomes that. And as part of that, we're also going to take oversight of what's described as the consent framework, or the framework for consent in higher education institutions. So what you see on the screen at the moment are just some of the priorities that we've that I've highlighted. So the first one is around gender equality. I suppose that's the main piece of work that we do, and really all of our work is stems from the 2016 review and the 2018 action plan. But what we're looking at moving forward is the possibility of another review. We're coming to the end of the life cycle of the previous policy documents, and it seems an appropriate time to revisit this and have another review and another national survey. Planning for that is in the early stages, and we will be going out for consultation on that, but that's just kind of a warning that that's coming down the line. Another piece of work that's high on the agenda is the further development of the Athena Swan Charter in Ireland, which will be engaging with both advanced HE and the higher education institutions on. Another area which I suppose was touched on in the questions previously was our work around race equality, and we've developed a national survey on race equality, which we're hoping to run in November this year. The survey was developed in conjunction with the Athena Swan Ireland Intersectionality Working Group. That particular working group is made up of experts from the institutions. So we're very happy with that particular piece of work, and we're hoping to run it now in November with a view to begin requesting staff ethnicity data at the end of the year. Now we're obviously aware that we may not get 100% response to that, but we're conscious that we'd like to start asking for the data to try and move this important agenda along. And then the final piece of work, which I won't really touch on, I won't touch on today, but which is a priority for the centre and also for the new minister, is the implementation of the consent framework, and there's a lot of ongoing work around that. So I suppose I'll segue into an update on the Athena Swan Charter in Ireland. The agreement with Advanced HE, which makes the Athena Swan Charter available to Irish higher education institutions, has traditionally had a 3-year agreement, and the previous agreement was up at the start of this year. So we were in a position where we were trying to reach a new agreement with Advanced HE, and in order to do that, we ran a survey of staff in higher education institutions, specifically staff who were engaged in the Athena Swan Charter, staff who were involved, I suppose, in central management of applications, but also staff in departments and so on who were making applications. So we went out with a survey, and we found that the feedback on Athena Swan in Ireland was actually really positive. As you can see from the slide, 94% of staff who were surveyed, and I think we coverage of all institutions, and we had about 70 staff, which I think is quite representative based on the fact that some institutions are still only at the stage of making institutional applications. So 94% of those did feel positive about Athena Swan and saw it as a means to raising awareness of gender equality issues in Irish HEIs. And there's generally positive feedback on the service provided by Advanced HE. some issues were raised around the lack of internal resources in HEIs for work around the Athena's One Charter, and also there are ongoing issues of the availability of benchmarkable data, and I'll touch on that issue more when I talk about the national context. But one thing that I suppose was positive was that a lot of those surveyed felt that the charter had now become an Irish charter and was well adapted to the Irish context, which may not have been the case going back 3 or 4 years. As part of the survey, we also, as part of the evaluation, we also went to Advance HE, and I suppose they really felt from their perspective that Athena Swan was embedded firmly in the Irish sector. Success rates are high. They're higher than in the UK, I believe. But there are still risks there. And one of the risks, I suppose, is around moving from institutional applications to a greater number of departmental applications, and the need for to guard against staff fatigue and so on. So these are all issues that we'll be discussing with Advance HE and with the sector in terms of the further development. And I suppose that consultation will be led by Dr. Victoria Brownlee, who's the head of Athena Swan Ireland, who I'm sure most of you know. And really some of the things that we'll look at, I suppose, is a further integration of professional management and support staff into the charter, and enhancing the requirements around sexual harassment and gender-based violence. So really, I suppose what we're looking for as the charter develops is to have a progressive charter that is globally comparable and also locally contextualized. And I think that is Advance HE's goal as they move into other jurisdictions outside of the UK. So we move into the national data context, and I suppose this we give some insight into the reasons behind the lack of benchmarkable data, and suggest some ways that we might be able to combat that. Currently at a national level, the HEA collects data from an equality, diversity and inclusion perspective in relation to staff by gender. As some of you know, this is collected annually. To date, it's been collected as male, female. We will be expanding the categories for 2020 to include other groups. Then I've already touched upon the fact that ethnicity statistics for staff will be the next area that we request. Working with the intersectionality working group, we've come to a decision that these will be the same as the CSO categories that we request, and I can share them with anyone who's interested. Also, importantly, and I think this feeds back into some what Tom was talking about in his talk around the fact that a lot of institutionally, a lot of this data, institutions are having to go out to staff who've already filled in their personal details and try to find this this information out after the fact. So the intersectionality working group has produced a statement which outlines the importance of the collection of this data, but also explains to staff who may be nervous about giving such data the reasons behind it. In other words, that it's an equality monitoring piece. It's not to prejudice against anyone. Now, one of the important points I was to make about this data collection is that this piece of data collection, these are bespoke requests, and they're separate to other HEA data collection. So if anyone is involved with supplying data at an institutional level, there is data collected, for instance, by the HEA governance section or by the statistics section. But the EDI data itself is collected on a once-off annually, and this is because currently we have no staff database. So nationally, the HEA has a student database, so we have better statistics around students. However, we found it difficult to implement a staff database, and there are issues around this where we're working with institutions, but it doesn't look like this will be available in the short or medium term. I suppose one thing on the horizon which may change that is the upcoming new HEA legislation. So that's just something to watch. But in the absence of that staff database, the main issue, I suppose, among others, is that the data that we collect at a national level is not intersectional. So the data that we have on gender, we can't connect that to the data that we will receive on ethnicity. So that's just something to bear in mind. It's just something that we'll have to wait and see what comes out of the legislation to see if we can advance that. Some of the other issues that we found through the Athena Swell evaluation, and then also through discussions with various stakeholders, are that we find that the HEA data reporting requirements don't always match perfectly with the Athena Swell applications. So I suppose we're always working with Advanced HE to try and make the twain meet in that instance, and that will also be part of the consultation that Victoria undertakes later in the year. And I suppose two of the big issues that we have when we ask for the data is that there's a lack of discipline-specific data for academic staff. This has proved difficult to get, and there are various reasons around it. It's around how institutions hold data, but also around how disciplines are defined. So that area, and then also there's also a lack of data on professional management and support staff in terms of grade and contract on the national level. So in light of these issues around data collection, we have set up a data working group, which I suppose we've asked for representation from all institutions on this, and what it's giving us is an opportunity to see what's happening across the board. So we've already begun to gather and analyze information on institutional efforts to collect staff data and disaggregate by gender. So basically what we're looking at is how institutions collect data and what similarities there are and what differences there are, and to try and I suppose on one level make institutions aware of the different practices, and then see how the HEA can work with the sector to align those practices. And one of the other areas, of course, is there are ongoing issues around the terminology and categories used for data collection. So I think for everyone, for the HEA particularly, it's useful to know what's going on in an institutional level, and for institutions to know what's going on in different institutions. So really, I might just skip through these slides, but they're here. So we did a survey of institutions around how they collect data, the categories they collect data in, and issues that there may be. So I'll skip through this because I'm kind of running short on time. But we had feedback from about 20 institutions, so we have information on categories of collection by gender, whether institutions collect ethnicity data, how they collect their data, what steps they would need to take to collect that data, if data is collected at disciplinary level, and again, what steps will be needed to supply that data disaggregated below the high level of arts, humanities, social science, business and law, and STEM. So I won't speak to those slides, but they're there, and I'm happy to share them with people after this. So that kind of brings me to the last thing that I wanted to touch on in this particular talk, and that is the issue of target setting, because I know it's something that when I talked to Rory many moons ago over a coffee in UCD, it seems like another lifetime at this stage. One of the issues that we were talking about was target setting, and we've received reports on progress against the 2016 review and the 2018 action plan. Some as part of the SALI applications last year, and then some we just requested from institutions who hadn't applied for SALI. So we have a fair idea of what's going on the ground. But clearly progress is being made in this regard, and institutions have taken those recommendations seriously and have integrated target setting into their own action plans. But the question always remains, what targets will be meaningful? And I suppose at a high level and at a minimum, from my perspective, I would say the following targets should be achievable and should be the ones that everyone at a minimum is aiming for. So the 40% of each gender in senior leadership positions, and the 40% of each gender on governance and management structures, and also it's not necessarily we're shying away from giving a target figure on this because it will differ. But the implementation of the flexible cascade model was a key recommendation of the 2016 review. Its implementation appears to have been uneven across the system, and it's one thing that I think we'd love to see implemented, and it has been shown to tangibly affect the gender balance at various levels. So I'll just touch on those areas quickly. So as I said, all HEIs have gender action plans. They all have targets in the gender action plans, and a lot of work has been done. But I think from my perspective, more work needs to be done. And one of the key aspects I think that I'd like to see implemented is a clear monitoring structure within institutions. And the progress reporting on that at regular intervals needs to be made at senior management level. So again, one of the key areas that all of the expert reports and all of the research shows is that all of this has to have buy-in at the very top level, at the most senior level, and the reports need to be filtered through those particular committees. Now, I understand there are difficulties for instance, in the IoT sector in relation to the contractual situations of introducing targets, but it is important to set the targets and aim for them. The second point I'd make is around the flexible cascade model. For those who are unfamiliar about what the flexible cascade model is, it's where the proportion of women and men to be recruited or promoted to a certain level is based on the proportion of each at the career level directly below. And again, this is shown to make a real difference if implemented. For those worried about how to implement it, the expert group did note that it is up to each HEI to determine how they would implement it. So we're not going to be prescriptive about it, but I think this is really key in order to advance gender equality. And the final piece, I suppose, I hit on is the gender balance and governance and management structures. And you'll see the table below shows the percentages there are the percentages of institutions who have gender balance on these committees. So in 2019, only 61% of Irish HEIs have gender balance on their governing body or authority, and 74% in terms of academic councils, and executive management teams were only barely over half of the institutions in Ireland have a gender balanced executive management team. So there's still a lot of work to do there, and this is 4 years after the 2016 review, and you can see the figures have jumped. Probably around, the figures have doubled, which is progress, but there's still progress to be made. And the other point is that even when the 100% is achieved across those management groups, it's also key to ensure that all key decision-making bodies within an institution have gender balance on them. I think I've probably gone over my time, but Rory hasn't been able to flash a card in my face, so I'll just or Marcelina either. So my details are there. If anyone wants to contact me or ask me any questions, I'm more than happy to talk to anyone. Marcelina.
Yeah, great, Ross. Listen, thanks very much for that. I know that's a real whistle-stop tour of all the work that's involved in this particular area that the Centre for Gender Excellence is undertaking. And I suppose it's more of a couple of comments maybe rather than questions, but you know, and you did touch on it, the fact that there is a huge lot of reporting requirements being kind of placed on higher education institutions back into the HEA and I suppose other avenues as well, like Athena Swan. So I think it would be very helpful if they could be kind of streamlined in some way or other. You know, for institutions, it does, you know, it is quite burdensome, possibly, you know, to submitting many different kind of reports from the institutions. But also in terms of the data collection, you know, it is voluntary data collection. And I'm just wondering, would there be any guidance from, you know, the centre around how to encourage, you know, people within the university to complete or record their data? You know, it's very sensitive data, obviously, and that we're asking. And yes, just some guidance around how we can encourage people to do that if we are, which the data we want anyway, but we're also required to submit it back to the HEA.
Yeah, so I suppose, and the big issue is about the data collection, I suppose. So just from I suppose it might be useful to explain it from a HEA perspective that there's a lot of data collected from a governance perspective and a funding perspective, which is essential in terms of the ECF and so on. And that data is collected to make sure that the books balance and so on. That's really what that data is being collected for. However, the data that the centre is requesting is purely EDI focused. It's equality monitoring. It's about making the situation in higher education better for people from all of the 9 categories and beyond. So that's, I suppose there are two different things there, and you know, this is an ongoing conversation, and really it's very difficult for them to meet. So the EDI piece will probably continue to stay outside. As I said, like the ultimate solution is a staff database, but we don't know where exactly that's going to sit. In terms of encouraging staff to collect the data, and I think that, you know, in discussions I've had, there's a tension between equality legislation and data protection legislation. And the discussions I've had in this regard, equality legislation should trump the data protection legislation. The GDPR or whatever doesn't stop us from collecting the data. And there are other equality acts at Irish and European level that institutions, you know, need to look into and consider, I think, more thoroughly in terms of how data is collected. Now, the statement made by the Intersectionality Working Group really is supposed to help, particularly in relation to the collection of ethnicity data. But again, I suppose that particular group is conscious of the need to always maybe to help institutions with the voluntary disclosure campaign and so on. And it's something that, like, from a HEA perspective, we're more than happy to work with people on. It might be something that stems out of the Athena Swan National Committee, because I suppose all the data collection really is feeding into people's Athena Swan applications. So it's something that we're more than happy to work on. Don't know if that answers the questions, Marcelina.
Yeah, no, that's great, Ross. Thanks very much. And I know we're kind of up against it time-wise, so I'll just, thanks very much
Can I just answer the question on the screen? There's just someone has asked a question around, just to know about hourly data on hourly paid and casual staff. And we're aware of this, we see it as an issue, and we're working to address it. I don't know if that answers the person's question, but it is something that we're aware of, and it's something that we need to do more work on.
That's great, Ross. Thanks very much. Okay.
Thank you, Ross. Just in terms of, I am conscious we've gone slightly over time, and if there are any other questions for Ross, maybe Ross, your contact details are on the screen anyway, so people can reach out to you or Aideen. Thanks very much for that. We actually are switching speakers in terms of if people have a schedule in front of them, because Olivia McAvoy is under time pressure. So Olivia, thanks very much for joining us this afternoon. Just in terms of a quick introduction for you, Olivia. Olivia is director of EY's Diversity and Inclusion Advisory Service in Ireland. She leads dedicated consultancy team to help clients achieve their diversity and inclusion ambitions as a key driver of talent acquisition, employee engagement, and ultimately growth and success in the marketplace. Marrying D&I with data analytics, her team help clients understand their D&I activities through objective assessments resulting in diagnostic outcomes, sustained strategies and roadmaps, KPIs, and an informed and enabled leadership. She's also author of EY's annual survey report of diversity and inclusion across the island of Ireland. And I remember fondly, I must say, in the Mansion House, when we were all able to get together. I went to a great event, it's probably about a year ago, Olivia, that EY ran to promote your survey. There were some excellent speakers that day. I just wish we could get back to that environment. But in the meantime, I'd love to just introduce you to everybody here and look forward to hearing your insights this afternoon. Are you okay to go there, Olivia? Can you hear me? Hi, Olivia. I think we may have a problem with Olivia's connection. Olivia, is it on mute, perhaps? Can you hear me? No? You can't hear me, no? Okay, look, that's a terrible pity. Okay, we might ask Olivia to try and maybe log back in. Can you hear me, Olivia? I can't hear you, no. You can hear me? Yeah. Just maybe try and log back in. We give it one try. So we give you a couple of minutes to log back in. If I had some music, I'd put it on right now. Apologies, Olivia, but just try and log back in, and we'll wait for your slot. Just in terms of feedback on the event, we'd love to hear back from you on the event. As I said at the start of the session, it's the first time we've run a webinar of this nature. I've been looking at the number of participants over the course of the morning. It's held very steadily, which is encouraging. We'd just love to get your feedback anyway, just in terms of what went well, what could be improved upon, and just generally your overall experience of the event. So if you can send that on afterwards, I think we will post up an email address around that or some contact details. And in the meantime, I see Olivia's name on the screen. Okay, I don't think it's going to work. Okay, maybe. Hey, Olivia? There's a volume. Can you hear me, Olivia?
Hearing you, Rory, yeah.
Brilliant, great. Well, I can hear you now as well for the first time.
Sound is very poor. So how does that sound on your end?
It sounds absolutely fine on my end. You're very, very welcome. I'm delighted to actually hear that. So we'll proceed and we'll see how it goes on.
Okay, and are you see the screen okay?
Yeah, everything is fine. I mean, just in terms of your presentation, it doesn't look to be showing the full screen. It just seems to be showing partially. You've got it in a separate, I'd say put it in the presentation format. It's in the, sort of a...
Yeah, I'm just having, in order to be able to actually hear you, I'm on a produced piece.
That looks better anyway, just even.
Just give us 1 minute and we'll try and get sorted here.
I was thinking of telling a joke, but I don't think it would have been particularly good. So the screen sharing is gone there now, Olivia. Someone's just asked me to sing a song. I'm not so sure about that.
Rory, I know that you have the slides at that end as well, so I'm not sure if you want to present the slides because there's definitely an issue with the technology, I think.
Okay, well, I just check with the team here. Leach or Tom, are you able to put up the slides?
Yeah, Leach is going to share them now.
Great, thanks, Tom.
I'm hearing about every second word, but if you can hear me, then that's great.
We can hear you, Olivia, pretty clearly. Certainly I can anyway, so we just wait for the slides.
Okay, very good.
Okay, they're on the screen now, Olivia. Can you see them?
Going, yeah, that's great. Thanks a million.
Okay, I'll hand it. Thank you.
I don't think any virtual conference is worth the salt now if there isn't some major. So I'm not thrilled that it was me that was the technology boo-boo, but I hope it's been going well so far this morning. Okay, Roy, I heard a little bit of that introduction, but not all of it, but thank you for that. I also say I have the great privilege of leading EY's Diversity and Inclusion Advisory Service, and delighted to know that you were in the Mansion House. I'll talk a little bit about that later. And if you want to move on there, Tom, just in terms of when we're working with clients, part of that consultancy, we deliver what's called a D&I transformation program. And that transformation approach is designed to deliver systemic change. And by that, I mean sustainable change that doesn't walk out the door with a particular D&I champion. We've heard from Lawson this morning, because we need changes to our systems and our structures and our processes, whether that's recruitment and hiring or leadership and development. And that diagnostic piece that you see there, that relies on both qualitative and quantitative data to establish what's working well, where are the gaps, and what is the employee experience of inclusion. And that gives you then the evidence base to develop the second module, which is the overall D&I strategy that's goal-orientated, that's metric and measurement focused, and that permeates the entire organization. The change in capability development that you see there is a very fancy way of saying, you know, inclusive leadership training, high performing teams training, and all underpinned by the fact that we also need to collect D&I data and use that data to create specific goals and benchmarks and milestone targets. So for me, it's particularly important that diversity inclusion is evidence-based. The challenge with that is that it seems to be seen as something as light and pink and fluffy. So we need to have evidence-based data in Ireland. So it's really gaining traction. We can measure that progress in the area and resulting progress in terms of business growth. I've seen a couple of comments flick through in terms of sound quality. It's definitely a sound issue, I think. But stop me if you want at any point. Tom, if you want to go on there in very simple terms, This is what it looks like. The diagnostic is allowed to understand where you are. The strategy is about understanding where you want to go. The analytics then understand the data, and then the change in capability is really empowering the leaders to develop and deliver on all of that. And just to give a slight deep dive on the next slide, Tom, please, on the diagnostic front, to achieve that transformation, we need to be both strategic and holistic. So, for example, as part of the diagnostic, we apply the NI lens right across every system and structure. So strategy and governance, people and performance, leadership development, data, what are you collecting, what are you analysing, and brand. And by that I mean, what are you saying internally to the market, and what are you saying externally as well, and internally to your own people. Rory mentioned in motion earlier, which comes up on the next slide, Tom, and just to underline the importance that we attach to data and evidence-based research. We conduct an annual survey of diversity and inclusion across the island of Ireland. We have about 150 individual organisational responses. UCD has been one such respondent, and we announced those results at a flagship diversity and inclusion summit called In Motion. And that is designed to really push the boundaries of thinking diversity and inclusion, encourage people to change gear and to really accelerate the pace of change and progress. And that survey obviously gives us great data about what is the state of the nation from a diversity and inclusion perspective. We did conduct one in 2020, but just closed before COVID hit. And I think it renders a lot of the information pretty void. So now that the dust has settled, I think we're going to reissue the survey, and it will enable us to compare and contrast information pre and post survey. So let's share the summary findings for the last 3 years. So we've conducted it for 3 years, as well as some of the 2019 data that's relevant. Again, Tom, if you want to go on there, the summary finding over the last 3 years is that there is a disconnect between the declared understanding of diversity and inclusion as a business imperative and the practice of actually nurturing it in organisations. So essentially, there's a disconnection between what organisations are saying and what they are doing in this space, and particularly across these 4 key areas that you see here. And firstly, just going on to the next slide, leadership behaviour. It is the cornerstone of an inclusive culture. But just over half are actually taking responsibility to call out inappropriate behaviour and language, which is an essential element of inclusion. But there is a strong sense that organisations are largely accepting of difference. 86% of the view that people of varying ethnicities are fully accepted and integrated into organisations. The second marker, which is on the next slide, Tom, is leadership accountability. One of the greatest game changers in diversity and inclusion success, but just 23% of leaders have got D&I goals or targets that are tied to their performance metrics and reward. In this sea of competing business priorities, it is simply too difficult for diversity and inclusion to compete unless there are accountability measures in place. But that said, 43% of senior leadership have now undertaken inclusive leadership training, and that's a 12% increase when we first started the survey in 2017. Thirdly, on the next slide is about investment. It's clearly correlated to positive results. Organisations spend more than €25,000 report much more favourable outcomes in terms of enhanced reputation, decision making, talent attraction, engagement, productivity, but too many invest too little. In the case of 31% of organisations that completed the survey, they're actually investing 0p. And I always say this won't happen by osmosis. We have got to invest the time and resource into diversity and inclusion if we want to be a success. Lastly then, on the next slide is a critical marker, which is measuring the impact of diversity and inclusion. It's pretty instrumental if they are to sustain that investment. But impact measurement is actually really rare. 100% every single survey respondent says that an inclusive environment is vital for business performance, which is specifically fueled by the importance organisations attach to thought diversity in particular and better decision making. But yet, just 16% of organisations actually measure the impact of diversity and inclusion on performance, whether that's through sales revenue or team performance or engagement or whatever it might be. But 60% are now publicly communicating information about their D&I goals and targets, and that very welcome transparency, I think, is likely to increase even further when the gender pay gap regulation eventually comes to fruition. Obviously, we were expecting it in 2019 and 2020, and it hasn't come yet with the change of government. And speaking of that regulation on gender pay gap, I think you might have touched a little bit on this, and that's on the next slide, Tom. 59% now favour regulation or legislation in general as a driver for creating more diverse and inclusive organisations. In advance of that pending legislation specific to gender pay gap, whenever it comes, 35% of organisations say that they've already taken the appropriate measures to address the causes of any gender pay gap. But even so, 29% of organisations would still say that they believe men are more likely to be promoted to leadership positions in that organisation. So all of that survey information, and we get a lot, we map to a maturity model. And that's on the next slide, Tom, and it runs from compliance to inclusion. Compliance is pretty much doing the bare minimum in order to be compliant with the law, not the biggest leap forward in the world to complacency, where there's a bit of an attitude of, listen, I don't really care who you are, what you're, where you come from, as long as you do the job, that's okay. Whereas when you move into an awareness, there is an awareness, yes, you probably have a strategy, you've probably got leadership buy-in, but there's just a general awareness that it is better. There are benefits to having a more diverse and inclusive organisation. Whereas it's only when you really move into integration and inclusion that it's really helping the organisation to drive innovation and to drive growth in the organisation. And there's a lot of criteria behind that, but I think the overall point that I would make is that as a nation, as an island, we're still fairly immature on this curve. In 2019, only 6% of survey respondents were in that integration, and none of us have reached that rate of inclusion just yet. So on the next slide, then, it just gives you an idea of what those pillars of maturity are. What are we looking for to move you up that maturity curve? Like I said, a lot behind, just some of the pieces. From a strategy and governance perspective, that it is becoming a core component, part of how you do business. You're putting that C&I lens right across every system, every structure. You've got a strategy, you're implementing that, and you're constantly evaluating and learning from that. The leadership, you would expect to have very visible leaders, role modeling inclusivity, very comfortable talking about it inside the organisation and outside the organisation. And then you begin to see that noticeable change in diversity profile. And then that big game changer piece, that leaders are actually held accountable for specific diversity and inclusion goals and objectives as part of their performance and management system. And then the important data, that data is collected, metrics are available, and they are used to inform that strategy for inclusion. And then the last one is that there is some kind of dedicated budget for resource, and there's some leaders and executive sponsorship driving diversity and inclusion through the organisation. In some instances, it's a full-time role for some people, as it is in UCD. Not all organisations would have that, but that somebody is given responsibility for driving it through the organisation. So that's what the survey data tells us, and it gives us a lot. And on the next slide, though, is we're just looking at what else can you do with survey data, and lots is the answer. I think maybe you might have touched on some of this earlier this morning. Obviously, conducting pay gap audits, whether that's for gender or ethnicity, as more frequently happening in the UK right now, other jurisdictions. It allows you to analyse diversity demographics at various stages of the recruitment process, and then use that to inform your recruitment strategy and practical process, like diverse slates and diverse panels. You can assess trends related to promotion, to performance, to talent development and reward. Use the data insight you get to understand sentiment and attitudes. Use the data to set targets and track progress, whether that's in relation to female candidates or minority groups. Visualize attrition across diversity categories, and just understand all of the key drivers for all of those. And just on the next slide or two, just having that data allows you to produce visual dashboards that really speak to people, and it allows you to visualize some of those trends that we talked about, and also have likes of data using whatever source that is, whether it's Power BI. I never get hung up on what the format is. We work with clients, what are your existing systems, whether we have to track all that through in a really simple Simon Excel spreadsheet and then produce the visuals on Power BI. I don't think it's a format that's important, it's the quality of the data that's coming through. But having that data allows you to produce the visual dashboards that speak to people, and also to boards. If you go on to the next slide, Tom, you can present key messages to boards and executive teams in a single slide on a monthly basis. So it's not a surprise to anyone if diversity targets are not met at the end of the year. They're tracked, they're monitored, they're visually presented the entire way along at board meetings on a monthly basis or whatever it is. But of course, all that only actually works if organisations are tracking the data in the first instance. And just on the next slide, just to finish out on some of the data around, well, what are people actually collecting? You can see that just over a third measure diversity and inclusion progress and success, and under a quarter have used DNI dashboards to visually present that data. Now this is still from 2019, as you see there. And then on the next slide, Tom, typically organisations are mostly collecting data on age and gender, as it would have been more typically collected through HR entry, for example, but much fewer organisations are collecting deeper than that on disability and race and religion. And I heard the last presenter talk about some GDPR concerns that are there. And in, I think it was 2018 in Motion, we had a GDPR specialist, our own GDPR specialist on stage, and she said, I would hate for GDPR to be used as an excuse not to collect DNI data. Because it doesn't have to be, obviously you can collect sensitive data with permission, and as long as you are GDPR compliant and stored in the appropriate measures, etc. But that data then is used to track that second graph there, used to track promotions, recruitments, applicants, attrition, performance ratings, and beyond. And you can see in the comparison corner piece, it is growing slowly over the years. We have seen the growth of that. So to conclude, I would say that data analytics, for me, big key pillar of that successful DNI program. Qualitative and quantitative data is helping us to understand the key actions, the measures for a successful DNI program, because it's not a one-size-fits-all in terms of DNI strategy. It's got to be bespoke to that particular organisation, and that's what helps us understand those key actions and measures for that particular organisation, so that you can have a successful DNI program, improve your business performance, get your best return on investment for your DNI efforts. And in addition to helping us measure the gaps, it also helps to identify, well, what's working well, because sometimes that gets lost. We always focus on the gaps, whereas we want to focus on what's working as well. But essentially enables us to get and set meaningful, impactful, but realistic goals and targets, and to measure that progress and success. And any business or organization's success demands investment. But business also demands evidence to justify that investment. And we know that diversity and inclusion requires significant effort and investment of resources. And if it is to compete in that sea of competing priorities, then we must gather the vast evidence that is available and justify that return on effort. And I think the organisations who inform those strategic efforts with data certainly get the best results. So I'm going to stop there, and apologies if there continue to be sound issues. I hope that was people could see. Just see some of these questions coming through.
Yeah, hi Olivia, can you hear me okay?
Yeah, it's pretty.
Yeah, no, well done. You got through it, and we could actually hear everything that was said. So thanks very much for that. And I'm breathing a sigh of relief, because I thought Rory might start singing, and which wouldn't be a good end to the conference. But so I know that we're a bit over time and that people have to go, and you're under time pressure yourself. But I suppose one question I would just have myself is, how do we encourage people to complete surveys? Because people can, suffer from survey fatigue. So how can we encourage them to continue to complete surveys? Like how frequent because if we survey people every year but people don't see change happening, do they get frustrated then and say, well, what's the point in filling this out anymore, because I filled it out last year and it's still the same situation, so what would your advice be about how frequently should we carry out these surveys, and how can we encourage people to meaningfully complete them?
Yeah, I mean, we conduct that survey annually, as you know, Marcelina, and we get a really great response every year, up to 150 separate respondents this year. Or in 2019, and it was beyond that for this year when they did come in. And I think the big piece is that you've got to always go back to people with the outcomes and be very open and honest about what those outcomes are, even if it is that there hasn't been much of an upward trend in progress. And to just really do very in-depth analysis and work with all of the information that you do get and communicate that widely, whether people are come to that in motion or not. But I do think it's important to do it at least annually, so that we have have some kind of benchmark, because, you know, back to that point that, you know, a lot of businesses in particular, yes, government sector, yes, public sector, but a lot of business will only react to numbers and to data and to hardcore evidence, because that's what they're used to dealing with in other elements of their business and their organization. So if we're going to compete with that from a diversity and inclusion perspective, we've got to have the data for benchmark, we've got to have the data for evidence base. So, you know, we can't afford to go out too often, but I think annually is, and also there's huge passion around this area, as you know. And I think by and large, people are pretty happy to support those on an annual basis if there's meaningful incomes or outcomes coming that they can use. Because, you know, we produce that survey, and yes, we get great use out of it ourselves, but it's used and cited extensively as well, not just in Ireland, but beyond Ireland. So as long as people can use the data and the outcomes of that, then I think they will always then feed into yours the following year.
Yeah. Excellent. It's really helpful. And just to, somebody did put up a question there. What are your thoughts on using images? Now it says in university publications for students. So I know you're not in that third level sector, but yeah, if you have any comment on that, that'd be great.
I think the big piece is that it has to be authentic, and we do see this in lots of the clients that we work with, where nobody wants to be the token diversity piece either. And so in a lot of organizations, they felt that they were well intentioned, thought they were doing the right thing, kind of hand-selected persons that they thought would fall into a diversity or a minority grouping in order to make sure that there was that representation. But there was a bit of a backlash, both against, you know, from the general population kind of saying, well, that actually doesn't really represent the organization, and also from the persons who have been summoned to say it felt like it was a bit tokenistic. So I think the big piece is that it has to be in tandem with an overall structure. So it's got to be in tandem with a wider strategy that is well communicated, that people understand this is part of our wider strategy to have a more diverse and inclusive organisation. If it is just on its own that you're dropping persons, you know, from minority groups or what you perceive as diversity, you know, for imagery purposes only, then people will rightly call you out instantly that is completely inauthentic and tokenistic, and as they should. But if it is coupled with a wider D&I strategy that actually is authentic and has meaning, and people get what it's sidled, you know, along with, then I think and absolutely we should have, you know, I'm also working with another client who recently published something that was just entirely, you know, white and very heterosexist, and there was obviously backlash against that. So it is about getting that balance right, I think.
Yeah, no, that's really valuable feedback. That's fantastic, Olivia. Listen, thanks very much. I think everyone would have got a lot from that, and we'll definitely be looking at that report in terms of how we present our own data as well. You know, we can certainly learn a lot from you. So we appreciate that, and no doubt we'll be following up with you, I'd say, as well in the future, you know, and anyone else who wishes to do so, who's here today. So thank you. I'm going to move on then to our final presenter of the day, and there's Mark Simpson, who is he heads up our employee engagement and internal communications function within UCD, part of the culture and engagement team. And so as part of his role, he's been instrumental in rolling out a series of employee surveys across the university in support of the mission to build and strengthen the community and make UCD a great place to work and develop. And the latest survey carried out by UCD was the Culture and Engagement Working from Home survey. So very relevant in the climate that we're in. So last but not least, Mark, please fire ahead.
Thanks very much, Marcy, and hello to everybody. Good afternoon. I suppose in the spirit of this being a data conference, I'm going to set my own KPI. So 80 of you are still here. So let's hope that I can keep most of you for the next 10 minutes. Is my screen sharing there okay, Marcy?
Perfect, Mark. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much. So as Marcy mentioned, we have used a lot of EDI demographic questions, and I want to share, I suppose, an example of a survey where we have used this information and how we use it in UCD. So the survey we're talking about, the Culture and Engagement Working from Home survey, was issued in June of this year after colleagues had been working from home for about 12 weeks. We felt that this was a good stage to understand what they were doing and what supports they might need. We used the Qualitative platform and relied on in-house expertise to analyse the results. I'm very grateful to Tom Costello, who you've met earlier in the UCD EDI unit, and Maura McGinn, UCD's Director of Institutional Research, for taking the raw data and producing the report, extracts of which I'm now going to share with you. The survey was issued via email using a common link to our 4,000 plus employees and contained about 50 plus questions. I suppose in hindsight, if we had longer to develop the survey, we would have cut down the questions somewhat. To assess the impact of working from home on different demographic groupings, respondents were asked to identify their gender, age, nationality, sexual orientation, ethnicity, and if they had a disability. In addition, we asked employees to categorize themselves as faculty, funded research contract, staff, or technical, and we also asked them to indicate their grade. Our objective in asking these categories is to try and identify if a particular cohort of employees was more negatively impacted as a result of working from home and what supports we might need to put in place. Response rates survey was 51%, which is similar to previous surveys that we've carried out. Interestingly, overall, I suppose what I'd say is that we found no material difference to responses by gender or other EDI demographic. In this, I mean that we were not able to identify groupings of employees where particular issues stood out as uniquely different for that demographic. This, of course, may not be the case if we were doing a more widespread employee survey. Just to run through some of the demographics, the gender breakdown of respondents indicated a 62% female and 33% male. This response reflects our population, which is 54% female, and our experience of surveys in UCD with a higher percentage of female responding. The age breakdown very much reflected the profile of the university, with 35% of respondents aged between 35 and 44. For nationality, the percentage of non-Irish respondents was lower than the UCD population, which is typically about 1/3 international staff. We're not quite sure why we didn't get a better representation on this, and something we'll have to think about in the future. We also asked an ethnicity question of respondents, the results of which you can see on screen there. We concluded the EDI demographic question section by asking about disability and sexual orientation. Again, all these questions were asked to see if we could identify populations with distinct issues, keeping in mind that only groupings of 10 or more respondents were reported to ensure anonymity. So then, looking at the actual findings of the survey, living arrangements was an area we focused in on. One of the key aspects, I suppose, we were interested to see was whether employees had children at home during this period. 58% of respondents indicated that they were either living with children or adult children. We also asked, apart from their own children, what other caring responsibilities employees may have. 23% indicated they did have other caring responsibilities. We suspect that this was higher than normal due to the pandemic. Again, this information was important so we could understand how policies might affect people when they are working from home and what other responsibilities they may have. Under working arrangements, we particularly wanted to find out how frequently employees worked from home prior to COVID-19. 73% had never or only worked from home every now and again. In comparison, when we did the survey, 87% were working from home. Again, this is a very significant change in working model, and we need to understand how it affects our employees. We also wanted to assess the impact of the shift to 100% online teaching due to COVID-19 on the workload of our faculty. 78% who responded stated they were doing more or significantly more teaching, including preparation of materials, and spending less time on research. When we look at these results through a gender lens, we saw no difference. Just to help you read this graphic, red indicates significantly more, with green being about the same and bronze significantly less. The chart is broken into 3 groupings: teaching, research, and other activities. We asked employees to assess the following challenges while working from home. 60% rated the ability to switch off from work or working longer and irregular hours as very to moderately challenging, while 52% indicated the same for taking leave. In addition, with 58% indicating anxiety about coronavirus, we felt we needed to continue to promote our suite of well-being supports for employees. 45% were finding childcare or homeschooling a challenge, reflective of the high proportion of our employees who stated they were living with children. We also had an open question which flagged the lack of home office equipment as an issue. Benefits of working from home. Aside from feeling safer in relation to COVID-19, which 79% indicated, many of the benefits rated highly, including reduced carbon footprint, no commuting, reduced commuting costs, more quality family time, and greater flexibility, are all benefits that we seek to retain for employees as we move back to normal and develop a flexible hybrid working model. Transition to working from home and well-being. 51% of respondents said they either adjusted well, enjoyed it, or find working from home very enjoyable or productive. 7% indicating that they were struggling was probably lower than we expected. We were conscious that a well-being question would be very much time dependent, so we attempted to see how well-being had changed over the period, and we're pleased to see that well-being levels were nearly back to pre-COVID-19 levels. 67% indicating that current well-being as being good or excellent. This is up from 48% after the first 2 weeks of working from home. We asked a series of questions around employees' experience with their line manager. 79% agreed or strongly agreed that they had sufficient contact with their line manager, while a similar percentage agreed or strongly agreed they were supported by their line manager. Again, these were results that we were pleased with and helped us understand the strong relationship between our employees and their managers. With a huge increase in video and conferencing, we wanted to check in with employees on their preference using this channel. 92% said their preferred communications channel was by video call, with the camera either on or off as personal choice. Interestingly, only 1% preferred the phone, which may be related to the relatively low level of work mobile phones in this organisation. With the closure of the university and move to online teaching, our extensive on-campus engagement programme ceased, and we rapidly moved online in an attempt to support our colleagues. Activities range from exercise focused to social and cultural events, along with encouraging local schools and units to organise their own activities. The vast majority of respondents who participated found the activities either excellent or useful. I suppose our challenge now as we move towards a more hybrid working model is to keep the level of engagement high with both online and campus-based activities. We're particularly interested to see if longer term remote working would be perceived as impacting on an individual's career and if there was a gender difference. 66% indicated they believe that in the longer term, working from home would have either no impact or a positive impact on their career. Again, for this response, we were unable to find a gender difference. We then sought to understand where a positive impact on career was indicated. What were the most important factors? 65% indicated less time and stress commuting, giving them more time for quality work, while 48% indicated greater flexibility as to how they managed their day. We also looked at factors where employees indicated a potential negative impact on their career. Less opportunity for collaborative relationships was indicated by 46%, while lack of appropriate work facilities was indicated by 31%. Future working arrangements. Overall, 76% of employees indicated they would like more flexibility to choose to work from home part-time, assuming a more normal environment in the future, i.e. creches and schools open, and that their role facilitated it. These findings would be very much in line, I think, with other surveys across both our own sector and further afield. As we were transitioning back to working from campus, we sought employees' views on how comfortable they were. 48% indicated being very comfortable or somewhat comfortable, while 12% indicated they were very uncomfortable returning to campus. This is a group that we need to work with to reassure further about the measures we're taking. Overall, exposure to COVID-19 was indicated by 79% of respondents concerned, with 50% highlighting decreased flexibility compared with working from home. Again, our remote working policy would hope to address this. To ensure transparency, a full presentation of all the results was distributed to employees along with a commentary from the President. Work is ongoing to further develop our remote working policy and communicate the supports we already have in place. While no material difference to responses by gender or other EDI demographic were identified, We intend to continue to ask for EDI demographic information in future surveys of this type and broader as a method of highlighting its importance and normalizing this data collection. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you very much. Just have one question, Mark, in terms of this. Like, for me, it's an observation and a question. The connection between culture, diversity, and data, you know, just in terms of, you know, the survey there is a very good example, I think, of the data collection aspect of it. And it's kind of a question, what do you do with it? You know, obviously, you may get some findings in a survey that demonstrate differences based on diversity criteria. And then, you know, where is the evidence then that it has an impact from a cultural point of view? Have you seen that in anything that you've done?
I think that's the difficult part of the job to some extent. You know, this survey, we weren't able to identify any specific actions we needed to take. I suppose longer term, what we're doing is making people, you know, more comfortable with collecting this data is an important aspect of it. We've only started collecting this in the last recent few surveys. So we're mainstreaming it. We're saying people, look, that we want to understand you as an individual and whatever demographic grouping you might fit in with. And, you know, I think that's the direction we're taking, but I can't give you a hard and fast example of a change we've made on the ground, I don't think, at this moment.
Okay, I'm just checking the inbox here. Let me just see, are there any other questions? What do you mean by material difference? It's not clear to what extent you've investigated or seen similarity elsewhere reported differences between genders and other demographics on some of these stats.
I suppose what I mean by material difference is that we didn't actually run a statistical program on every single cross-cutting piece of data in the survey. What we were looking for was kind of, you know, obvious differences that we could address. So where, you know, we were quite, I suppose, prepared in the outset that there would be significant gender differences. We felt that, you know, maybe career prospects will be seen as more negative for females than males. But interestingly enough, these type of things didn't come across. So, you know, I suppose that's what I mean by material. We were looking for the larger stuff. We weren't looking for a kind of a 0.1% or 0.2% here and there. We were looking for big gaps where we thought there might be some, and we were surprised that there wasn't.
Okay, thanks very much, Mark. Thanks very much for that presentation. I'm just very conscious that, you know, we started slightly late. We had, the gremlins did appear eventually. Thankfully, it was towards the end. But I just wanted to say thank you to everybody that has attended today's event, those that remain with us. There was a very consistent number, I think, throughout the morning. I really, really appreciate the work and effort and the excellent content of all of our presenters this morning and this afternoon as well. You know, it's a pity we can't actually gather for lunch afterwards and I suppose share some of the experiences that we've had, but we've got all the contact details. I think people should reach out. We'll certainly be reaching out to people after this event. I also just wanted to thank the organisers in particular. I want to call out Tom Costello and Licia Carlisi. Marcelina Fogarty, of course, as well, has been very, very key to organising and driving this conference. And other than that, I just want to hand over to Marcelina, my co-moderator, and see if she's got any final words that she wants to add.
No, just thanks to everybody for attending, and especially to the people who stayed to the bitter end. And as I said before, you know, the recording will be on our website, and the presentations will be made available. And we do want to evaluate, you know, how the conference went. Obviously, one thing is we went over time, so we know that. So it's something we have to work on in future. But my colleagues will be in contact with all delegates just to follow up with links to web pages, etc. So thanks very much to everyone for attending, and you know, we're delighted that we had such brilliant speakers today. So thank you.
Thank you. Are you staying on, Marcelina?